There is a particular kind of man history cannot quite decide what to do with. Not the straightforward villain, not the uncomplicated hero, but the man who sits between those categories like a stone lodged in a doorway, holding both rooms open at once, belonging fully to neither. History has many such men, but few as studied, as argued over, as genuinely difficult to resolve as the one at the center of this story. His name was Erwin Rommel. He was born in a small Swabian town to a mathematics teacher and a pastor's daughter. He was not born into wealth, not born into privilege, not born into the kind of family that produces generals. He was, by every measure of his early life, an ordinary boy from an ordinary place. And yet, by the time he was in his early 50s, his name was being spoken with fear in London, with reverence in Berlin, with bewildered admiration in Cairo, and with something approaching awe in the deserts of North Africa, a landscape so hostile, so remorseless, so utterly indifferent to human ambition that it seemed almost designed to break men rather than make them. It did not break Rommel, not at first. What it gave him, instead, was a legend. And legends, as we will spend the next several hours discovering together, are complicated things. They are built from truth and from myth in roughly equal measure, and the seam between the two is rarely where we expect to find it. There is a version of Rommel that became enormously popular in the decades after the Second World War, a version promoted, strangely enough, by many of the men who had fought against him. In this version, he is the clean warrior, the desert knight, the professional soldier who played the game of war with skill and honor, while the ideology that sent him into the field remained somehow separate from the man himself. His enemies praised him while he was alive because it made their own struggles more dignified. If the man hunting you across the western desert is brilliant and honorable, then being pushed back by him carries no shame. And after the war, when the world needed to make sense of what Germany had done, there was a certain usefulness to the idea of a German officer who had simply been a soldier, nothing more, nothing less. That version of Rommel is not entirely wrong. It is simply not entirely right, either. The truth is more interesting. It almost always is. Because the real Erwin Rommel was not a symbol, not an archetype, not a convenient narrative device for anyone's post-war comfort. He was a human being, competitive, brilliant, sometimes reckless, personally brave to a degree that occasionally bordered on self-destructive, genuinely loved by many of the men who served under him, genuinely frustrating to almost every superior officer he ever had. He was a man who could read a battlefield the way a musician reads a score, instinctively, rapidly, with an ear for what was coming several bars before it arrived. He was also a man who made catastrophic errors, who stretched his supply lines past all reasonable limits, who could be utterly ruthless in pursuit of an objective, and who served, for years and with genuine commitment, a regime whose crimes now define the darkest chapter in modern history. He was not outside that regime. He was not untouched by it. He was, in his own way, part of it, and the degree to which he understood that, the degree to which he eventually came to reckon with it, forms one of the most sober and genuinely moving arcs of his entire story. This documentary will take you through all of it. We begin in Württemberg, in the closing years of the 19th century, in a Germany that still had a Kaiser and a confidence in its own destiny that had not yet been shattered by the mud and wire of the Western Front. We will follow young Erwin through his enlistment, through the First World War, through the interwar years of poverty and political chaos, through his rising prominence in an army being secretly rebuilt beneath the noses of the powers that had defeated it. We will follow him into Poland, into France, and then south, into the furnace. North Africa will occupy the heart of this film, because it is where the Rommel legend was forged, tested, tarnished, and finally broken. 3 years of campaign across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. 3 years of outrunning supply lines, of improvising with inadequate resources, of winning battles that arithmetic said could not be won, and then, slowly, inevitably, of facing an enemy that had learnt his methods, matched his resources, and exceeded them. We will stand with him at the high point of his career, when it genuinely seemed possible that one German general with a relatively small force might alter the balance of the entire war. And we will watch, with equal attention and equal honesty, as that moment passes and does not return. Then Europe again, the Atlantic Wall, the beaches of Normandy, a war that even he, by 1944, understood was already lost. A conspiracy, a choice forced upon a man with nowhere left to turn. And finally, legacy, perhaps the most complicated chapter of all, because it asks not just who Rommel was, but who we needed him to be, and whether those two things can ever be fully reconciled. If you are settling in for the night, you are in exactly the right place. This is the kind of story that rewards patience, the kind that gets richer the longer you stay with it, the kind where the details matter, where the moments between the famous battles are sometimes more revealing than the battles themselves. Pour yourself something warm, find a comfortable position. You are going to be here for a while, and there is nowhere better to be. If you have found this channel and this is your first time here, welcome. What we do is take the full sweep of a historical life, every chapter, every turning point, every complication, and give it the time and attention it deserves. No shortcuts, no oversimplifications. We trust you to handle complexity, because that is what history actually is. If you want to be here for every story we tell, subscribing now means you will not miss what comes next. It costs you nothing and it means everything to a channel built on this kind of work. And if you are already part of this community, you already know what is coming, and you already know it is worth staying for. The story of Erwin Rommel is the story of one man's journey through the most violent century in human history, shaped by it, elevated by it, ultimately consumed by it. It is a story about what brilliance looks like when it is placed in service of the wrong cause. It is a story about the distance between reputation and reality, between the myth a man becomes and the life he actually lived. It begins in a quiet town in southern Germany. It ends on a road outside a small village on the 14th of October 1944 in a German staff car with a cyanide capsule and no way out. Between those two moments is everything. Let us begin. There is a town in the southwest of Germany where the land rises and falls in quiet hills, where the air carries the cold clarity of the Swabian plateau, and where life, in the closing years of the 19th century, moved at the pace of chalk on a blackboard. Heidenheim an der Brenz sits in the valley of the Brenz River, a place of modest industry and older stone, surrounded by forests that have watched centuries pass without hurry. It was not a place that produced legends. It was a place that produced teachers, craftsmen, and civil servants, men who understood duty as something close to breathing, something done without ceremony or complaint. Into this world, on the 15th of November 1891, Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel was born. He was the second of 4 children, and nothing about his arrival announced anything extraordinary. No prophet waited at the door. The hills of Württemberg simply received another son. His father, Erwin Rommel Sr., was a secondary school headmaster, a man of precision and patience, devoted to the orderly world of mathematics, where problems submitted to method and method produced answers. He was not a military man, and he harbored no particular romance for soldiering. What he gave his children instead was something arguably more durable, the habit of rigorous thinking, the understanding that problems yielded to those who approached them without panic and with enough persistence. In the classroom and at the family table, the elder Rommel modeled a kind of calm authority, not cold, but measured, the authority of a man who had considered things carefully before speaking. His mother, Helene von Loos, came from a family connected to the local civic aristocracy of Württemberg, her background carrying a genteel sense of propriety that colored the household's atmosphere without ever becoming suffocating. Together, the two parents created a home that was orderly without being loveless, disciplined without being joyless. Young Erwin grew up in that particular middle-class German world that valued education, Protestant faith, and the kind of quiet respectability that asked nothing theatrical of its inhabitants. He attended local schools, sat through lessons, and by most accounts showed no early signs of military genius. He was not, by the standards of boyhood adventure, a natural warrior. Contemporary accounts describe a physically slight child, somewhat reserved, who showed more interest in mechanical and mathematical problems than in rough play or martial fantasy. He and a friend reportedly constructed a working glider from scratch as boys, a project that required patience, spatial reasoning, and the willingness to fail and revise, which tells you something useful about how his mind worked. Whether the glider flew is almost beside the point. The attempt itself reveals the template of the man who would later improvise battle plans in the middle of moving offensives, treating war itself as an engineering problem to be solved under pressure. The Germany into which Rommel was born was the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II, a nation young by the standards of European powers, unified only in 1871 after Prussia's wars of consolidation, and still wearing its new nationhood with a certain anxious energy. The army sat at the center of this national identity in a way that civilian institutions simply could not match. Officers were not merely soldiers. They occupied a social position that commanded deference in shops, on railway platforms, at dinner tables. The uniform carried weight that no schoolmaster's jacket quite equaled, and even a boy with no particular taste for violence could understand that the military offered something the classroom did not: status, adventure, and the chance to act rather than merely to analyze. As Rommel moved through his teenage years, it was this combination, the pull of adventure against the push of a life already mapped out in chalk dust, that began to redirect his thinking. He was not, to be plain about it, drawn to the army by ideology. Württemberg, in the early 1900s, was not a place seething with martial nationalism, and the Rommel household showed no signs of political extremism in any direction. What attracted the young Erwin was something more personal and more practical, the idea that soldiering was a craft, and that craft rewarded those who studied it with the same seriousness his father brought to quadratic equations. He had observed, as any thoughtful adolescent might, that the world seemed to arrange itself into those who acted and those who watched the acting. He did not intend to watch. Around the age of 14 or 15, his ambitions began to crystallize in the direction of the military, though his father reportedly had reservations about the choice, preferring perhaps that his son enter engineering or aeronautics, fields where mathematical talent could find respectable civilian expression. The father's hesitation was understandable. The son's direction, once set, was not. His application to officer training was not immediately smooth. The family's modest social standing placed certain doors slightly out of reach, and his early academic record offered nothing spectacular enough to force those doors open by sheer brilliance. He applied to a military academy and was initially passed over, a small rejection that might have deflected a less determined young man toward safer paths. He did not deflect. He persisted with the methodical patience that would later characterize his tactical planning, returning, adjusting, waiting for the opening that persistence sometimes creates where talent alone cannot. In 1910, at the age of 18, he was accepted as an officer cadet in the 124th Württemberg Infantry Regiment, beginning his formal military life at the bottom, as all military lives must begin. The world he entered was one of rigid hierarchy, physical rigor, and a culture of obedience that expected young officers to absorb doctrine before they questioned it. Yet even in this environment, something distinguished Rommel from his peers, not insubordination, but a quality of attention. He watched. He asked why a formation moved in one direction rather than another, why certain defensive arrangements failed under pressure and others held. His instructors later recalled a cadet who was serious without being stiff, competitive without being vindictive, and possessed of a physical endurance that belied his slight build. He ran farther, stood longer, complained less. The body that looked unremarkable in civilian clothes revealed, under military conditions, a quiet ferocity, the capacity to sustain effort long after comfort had departed. This, too, was a lesson he would carry forward into every campaign he ever commanded. There is something worth pausing over in the geography of his childhood, because landscape shapes temperament in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to recognize. The Swabian Alb, the plateau that forms the geological spine of Württemberg, is a terrain of hard winters, thin soils, and communities that learned long ago to make much from little. The people who came from it, and historians have noted this with some frequency, tended toward a particular combination of frugality and stubbornness, an ingrained distaste for waste in any form. Rommel would carry this into his conduct of war, running campaigns on logistics that would have horrified more comfortable commanders, treating supply lines not as bureaucratic irritants but as tactical problems, demanding the same creativity as any engagement. The desert campaigns for which he became famous would demand exactly this, the ability to sustain operations on the absolute minimum, and it was a capacity that had roots deeper than military training. His enlistment in 1910 also coincided with a particular moment in European history, when the great powers had been circling one another for a generation, building armies and navies, signing and breaking alliances, all while the civilian populations of the continent remained largely unaware of how close to the edge the whole apparatus was drifting. For a young officer cadet in Württemberg, this background tension was more abstract than immediate. The training focused on the wars of the previous century, the Franco-Prussian victories that had defined modern Germany's military self-image, and on doctrines built for conflicts that had already been fought. What was coming was something none of those doctrines had fully imagined. Rommel would spend the rest of his career living in the gap between what military doctrine prescribed and what actual combat demanded, and his instinct was always to trust the latter. His years of basic training and early commissioning shaped the practical armature of his character, without yet revealing what he would become. He was diligent, fit, determined, qualities that distinguished him from the merely average without yet setting him far apart from the genuinely talented. The wars that would forge him into something extraordinary lay still ahead, separated from these quiet Württemberg years by only a few turns of the calendar. Those who knew him in this period described an earnest young man with a dry sense of humor, a methodical habit of mind, and an almost complete absence of the posturing that military culture sometimes encouraged in the ambitious. He had no interest in performing soldierliness for an audience. He was interested in what actually worked. What Heidenheim gave Rommel, in the end, was not inspiration or mythology. It gave him foundations. A father who taught him that precision mattered. A mother whose household instilled the kind of practical dignity that does not require applause to sustain itself. A landscape that trained generations to endure. A modest beginning that offered no shortcuts, and therefore forced the development of the patience and persistence without which his later brilliance would have had nothing to stand on. He left Württemberg as a young man carrying these things inside him, invisible as packed snow, heavy as the mathematics his father loved. He would not return to that quiet valley the same person. No one who walks through the decades ahead ever does. But the man who eventually became one of the most written about commanders of the 20th century began here, in the unremarkable middle of ordinary German life, with a glider that may or may not have flown and a mind already searching for the problem that would prove worthy of it. He was 22 years old when the world went to war. The summer of 1914 arrived in Europe like a door slamming shut on the old order, and for a young lieutenant, freshly commissioned from the military academy at Danzig, it arrived as an invitation. Erwin Rommel had spent the previous years drilling, studying, absorbing everything the Württemberg army could teach him about the craft of soldiering. He had shown himself to be something more than competent, methodical where others were careless, aggressive where others hesitated. His instructors had noticed. His superiors had noticed. Now, in the chaos of a continent mobilizing for a conflict no one fully understood, the young man from Heidenheim would have the chance to put every lesson to work in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable. What he learned there would stay with him for the rest of his life. His early months in the field introduced him to violence on a scale that no peacetime training could simulate. Fighting in the Argonne Forest on the Western Front, Rommel encountered not the swift, decisive war of movement that German military theory had promised, but something rawer and more terrible. The terrain swallowed formations whole. Men who advanced with textbook precision were cut down by fire from positions they could not see. The world offered no logic, no clean lines of attack, no obvious ground to seize, no clear moment when one side had simply won. Yet even in these earliest engagements, something distinguished the young lieutenant from his peers. Where other officers waited for clarity before acting, Rommel moved. He gathered what information he could, made his best assessment, and acted before the enemy could adjust. It was instinct sharpened by intelligence, and it worked. The Western Front, in those opening months, offered Rommel a brutal education in the cost of hesitation. He led his platoon through actions in which men were lost and ground was gained only in meters. He was wounded in the fighting, a wound serious enough to send him briefly away from the front for recovery. Most men in his position would have welcomed the rest, if only for a moment. Rommel does not appear to have welcomed it at all. His surviving correspondence from this period reflects a man straining toward the fight, impatient with recovery, eager to return to the one environment where his particular skills had meaning. This was not recklessness. It was closer to vocation, a sense that the field was where he belonged, and that absence from it was a kind of failure, however involuntary. By the time the Western Front had calcified into the grinding stalemate of the trenches, Rommel had begun to understand something that would take the broader military establishment years to accept. The war of fixed lines and massed frontal assault was not simply costly, it was strategically bankrupt. Artillery barrages that lasted for days failed to destroy defenders sheltering in deep positions. Waves of infantry advancing in formation were destroyed before they reached the enemy wire. The old equations of force no longer held. Yet the machines of command on both sides continued to feed men into the same failing approaches, adjusting only the scale, never the method. Rommel absorbed this failure not with despair but with analysis. He was cataloging what did not work with the same rigor he would later apply to discovering what did. His transfer to the Romanian and Carpathian theaters brought him into a different kind of war, more fluid, more dependent on local initiative, more forgiving of the aggressive small unit tactics he had been developing. The terrain in the Carpathians was mountainous and demanding. Supply lines were fragile, and the kind of centralized control that characterized the Western Front was simply impossible to maintain. Junior officers were forced to make decisions that elsewhere would have required the approval of men several ranks above them. For Rommel, this was not a hardship, it was a revelation. He thrived precisely because the environment demanded exactly the qualities he had in abundance: speed of thought, tolerance for uncertainty, and the capacity to read ground and enemy behavior simultaneously. His unit began to accumulate a record that attracted attention far beyond its modest size. It was in these Eastern operations that Rommel's signature approach began to fully crystallize. He led from the front, not as a gesture of personal bravery, though bravery was genuinely required, but because he believed that a commander who could see what his men saw could make better decisions than one receiving reports filtered through layers of communication. He moved faster than expected, deeper than authorized, and with more confidence than his numerical strength justified. He understood that uncertainty worked both ways, that an enemy confused about where his forces were and what they intended was already partly defeated. Speed and aggression, he was learning, were not simply tactical tools. They were weapons in their own right. During the mountain campaigns, Rommel led actions in which small groups of his men seized objectives that far larger conventional forces had failed to take. He exploited terrain that defenders considered impassable. He found gaps in enemy lines that had been declared non-existent. He accepted supply shortages and exhausted soldiers and moved anyway, because he understood that the moment of enemy confusion was perishable. that if he waited for perfect conditions, the window would close and the opportunity would die with it. These were not lucky improvisations. They were the product of careful, real-time assessment combined with a willingness to act on incomplete information that most of his contemporaries found genuinely alarming. In the German military hierarchy of the time, such behavior by a junior officer was almost as likely to attract censure as commendation. The commendations came. Rommel was awarded the Iron Cross, First Class, a decoration that carried genuine weight in a military culture that distributed such recognition carefully. He was mentioned in dispatches, promoted ahead of schedule, and given responsibility that exceeded his nominal rank. Officers who served alongside him described a man who was simultaneously demanding and inspiring, who expected from his soldiers the same exertion he demanded from himself, and who generated loyalty not through warmth alone, but through the more durable currency of demonstrated competence. Men followed Rommel into dangerous ground because he had already shown them, repeatedly, that his assessments were more reliable than the official picture. They did not always survive the following, but they followed. The Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor, known informally as the Blue Max, came to Rommel toward the war's end, recognition of his actions in the mountain fighting. To receive it as an infantry officer of his rank was exceptional. The decoration was typically the province of senior commanders and celebrated pilots. For a junior officer fighting on foot in difficult terrain to earn it spoke to the unusual nature of what he had accomplished. He received it not for commanding great masses of men or orchestrating theater-level operations, but for the intimate, lethal work of small unit leadership, conducted under conditions that had broken more experienced officers. Germany in 1918 was a country eating itself from within, but within that collapse, the young Rommel had found his proof of concept. What the Great War did to Rommel was inseparable from what it did to his entire generation. Millions of young men entered that conflict and were consumed by it, their bodies left in the mud of France, their spirits broken in the hospitals and prisoner of war camps, their futures canceled before they had properly begun. That Rommel survived was partly luck and partly his own formidable situational awareness. Men who led from the front in that war died at a rate that made survival almost improbable. But survival is not the same as emergence. What distinguished Rommel was that he came out of the war with a developed, coherent philosophy of combat that had been tested under the most merciless conditions imaginable and had not failed him. While the war was killing his contemporaries, it was also, in the hardest possible way, educating him. He carried specific lessons forward, the lesson of tempo, that speed disorganizes an enemy in ways that firepower alone cannot, the lesson of ground, that terrain is not just a stage for combat, but an active participant in it, offering or withholding opportunity at every step, the lesson of command, that a leader who shares the danger of his men understands the situation in a way no map or report can fully convey, and the lesson that perhaps mattered most of all, that the enemy's fear, confusion, and uncertainty were resources to be exploited as aggressively as any physical advantage. These were not theories Rommel had read in a book. They were conclusions drawn from personal experience in fights where being wrong meant dying. The war had handed him a curriculum written in blood, and he had mastered it. The armistice came in November of 1918, and Rommel returned to a Germany that barely resembled the country he had left. The monarchy had collapsed. The streets of Berlin were contested by political factions. The Reichswehr, rebuilt from the wreckage of the old imperial army, was a shroud of the force that had mobilized 4 years earlier. None of this matched the inner world of a young officer who had earned the highest decoration his country offered and had returned to find the country itself hollowed out by defeat. He did not write extensively about this period in personal terms, but a man who had spent 4 years in an environment where excellence was immediately and violently tested, who had been told by the highest military authority that his approach was correct, that man did not simply return to obscurity and wait. He carried his war inside him, catalogued and annotated, ready for the next time the world required what he had become. Germany, 1919. The armistice had silenced the guns, but it had not silenced the chaos. A nation that had sent its young men into the trenches under the banner of an emperor now stumbled forward without one. The Kaiser gone into Dutch exile, the old certainties dissolved overnight into something nobody had quite prepared for. The streets of Berlin and Munich hummed with a dangerous, fractured energy. Veterans returning to a country that could not feed them, politicians arguing over a republic that millions had never asked for, and revolutionary movements of every color competing to fill the vacuum left by the collapse of the imperial order. Into this fractured country, Erwin Rommel returned from the front. He was 27 years old, a decorated officer with an Iron Cross and a mind sharpened by years of close combat, and he came home to discover that the world which had shaped him had simply ceased to exist. The army he rejoined was a diminished thing. The Treaty of Versailles had prescribed its dimensions with surgical severity. No more than 100,000 men, no heavy artillery to speak of, no air force, no general staff in the traditional sense. Entire regiments that had borne illustrious histories through 4 years of grinding warfare were disbanded, their colors furled and stored, their officers scattered into civilian life or squeezed into a force reduced to a skeleton of its former self. The institution that Rommel had entered as a young cadet in 1910, full of purpose and professional promise, now existed under the watchful eye of Allied inspection commissions, stripped of the apparatus that had defined German military power for half a century. For an officer of his caliber, the prospects were narrow. Advancement was slow, resources were scarce, and the men who rose were those who had demonstrated not just battlefield ability, but also the patience to endure a long and unglamorous peace. Rommel endured it. He had never been a man drawn to the salons and political intrigues that consumed officers in capital cities. His instincts were practical, rooted in the physical realities of ground and movement, the way a squad of men could seize an objective before the enemy understood what was happening. He accepted his postings, infantry commands in provincial garrisons, training assignments, instructional roles, and he threw himself into them with the same intensity he had given to combat. Those who served under him in these years remembered an officer who demanded precision and rewarded initiative, who led by example on the training ground and expected his junior officers to think rather than merely obey. He was not popular in the easy, sociable sense. He was respected, which, in the Reichswehr's straitened circumstances, was the more durable currency. The Reichswehr itself was a peculiar institution during these years. Small by design but paradoxically selective, its reduced size forcing it to retain and develop officers of genuine quality. Within its quiet professional corridors, debates about the future of warfare were sharpening into something consequential. Men were thinking seriously about mobility, about the application of motor vehicles and aircraft to operations that the last war had reduced to mud and wire and attrition. Rommel was not the only officer asking these questions, but he asked them from a distinctive position, from the perspective of a man who had practiced mobile infantry tactics at the small unit level and had seen, repeatedly, what happened when an enemy was surprised and his response time was denied him. His instincts about war's tempo were not theoretical. They had been wrung out of experience on the Isonzo and in the Carpathians, where seconds and meters had meant everything. During these years, Rommel taught infantry tactics at the Dresden Infantry School, and it was there that his intellectual life as a soldier found its clearest expression. Teaching forced him to articulate what he had previously felt through instinct. He had to explain to young officers not merely what he had done in battle, but why. What principle of movement or timing or psychological disruption had produced a given result? The classroom became a laboratory for everything he had survived. He was not a theorist in the academic tradition, and he made no pretense of being one. He was a practitioner who happened to have thought carefully about his practice, and in that combination lay something rare. His lectures drew on personal memory, on the specific texture of moments from the war, and the students who heard them came away with a sense not just of tactical precept, but of war as it actually felt from the ground up. It was out of this teaching that his memoir began to take shape. The book he was working toward was not a grand strategic analysis. It was something more intimate and more useful, a close examination of small unit engagements, drawn from his own experience, intended to illustrate the principles he believed were fundamental to infantry fighting. He wrote as he spoke, directly and without embellishment, with a Swabian plainness that stripped away the rhetorical padding common to military writing of the era. His ambition was not literary fame. He wanted young officers to understand how battles at the company and battalion level were actually won, what role speed and initiative and the willingness to accept uncertainty played in the decisive moments. The manuscript took years to develop, but the discipline of writing it, of reconstructing engagements, of analyzing his own decisions under fire, also deepened his own understanding of what had made him effective. While Rommel wrote and taught, Germany burned and froze and burned again. The early years of the Weimar Republic were years of spectacular political violence, attempted coups from both the nationalist right and the communist left, hyperinflation so severe that ordinary families carried money in wheelbarrows to buy bread, political assassinations that claimed ministers and judges and journalists. The Republic's survival during these years was not assured. It lurched from crisis to crisis, held together by a combination of Allied pressure, institutional inertia, and the reluctant commitment of enough Germans who preferred a flawed democracy to the alternatives. Rommel watched all of this from his professional distance. His letters and recorded observations from the period do not suggest a man consumed by political passion or ideological alignment. What they suggest is a soldier who was paying attention, who saw that Germany was sick and unstable, who was not naive about it, but who had placed his identity wholly within the framework of the officer corps rather than within any political movement. That separation, in the context of what was coming, demands careful consideration. The Weimar years produced a generation of officers who navigated the question of political identity in different ways. Some moved toward the nationalist right with genuine conviction. Others maintained the Prussian tradition of apolitical service with something approaching religion. Rommel occupied a position that was neither ideologically indifferent nor ideologically engaged. He was a professional to his corps, and professionalism was itself a form of insulation. He did not join the National Socialist German Workers' Party in these years. He did not attend their rallies or contribute to their publications, but neither did he speak out against them as they grew. He was, in the most specific and neutral sense of the word, uninvolved, and in Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s, uninvolvement was also a kind of choice. The years of relative stability in the mid-1920s gave way, after 1929, to the long economic catastrophe that the Great Depression brought crashing down on a country that had never fully recovered from the previous decade's chaos. Unemployment climbed to figures that seemed impossible, then climbed further. The parties of the moderate center, which had never commanded deep popular loyalty, began to hemorrhage support to the extremes. Adolf Hitler's movement, which had embarrassed itself in a failed putsch in 1923, reassembled its ambitions and found that the desperate, humiliated German electorate was now far more receptive to its message of national resurrection and racial resentment. The political ground was moving faster than most people recognized, and by the early 1930s, what had seemed like a lunatic fringe was becoming a mass movement with a credible claim on power. Rommel's published memoir appeared in this atmosphere in 1937, though its intellectual seeds had been planted in the classroom years of the late 1920s. By the time it reached print, Germany had already passed through its constitutional crisis and arrived at something no longer recognizable as the Republic. But the book itself bears no fingerprints of the new political order. It is a technical document rooted in the particulars of fire and maneuver and command decision, and it made his reputation among serious military professionals across Europe. The timing was significant, not because Rommel had calculated it, but because Germany's military was expanding again and looking hungrily for a literature of excellence to justify its ambitions. His name became attached to a certain idea of what a German officer could be: aggressive, creative, indifferent to physical danger, capable of reading a battle faster than his opponent could respond to it. What the Weimar years ultimately produced in Rommel was not a changed man, but a refined one. The values he had carried from his Swabian childhood, discipline, directness, the conviction that personal integrity and professional competence were the only foundations worth building on, had been tested by a war that claimed a generation, compressed by the austerity of peacetime service, and deepened by the long intellectual labor of teaching and writing. He had survived the collapse of one Germany and was now navigating the emergence of another. He had not made his peace with the new order so much as he had simply continued being a soldier, as if the political weather around him were something a man of his trade was not meant to interfere with. That instinct, to serve the nation through the army, wherever the army's command led, would carry him to the highest ranks and the most complex dilemmas a military man could face. But in the years between the wars, it kept him insulated from a truth that would, eventually, become unavoidable. Germany was changing, not slowly, the way nations usually change, through argument and compromise and the quiet erosion of old certainties, but violently, convulsively, the way a river changes course after a flood. By the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler had been appointed Chancellor of the Reich, and the political machinery that had limped through the Weimar years began to be dismantled with startling speed. For Erwin Rommel, an infantry officer in his early 40s, professionally capable and politically disengaged, the transformation of Germany was something he observed from a careful distance. He had spent the preceding years teaching, writing, refining his craft inside the shrinking walls of the Reichswehr, a soldier's soldier in an army of reduced ambitions. He did not wear a party badge, he did not attend rallies. What he wore, instead, was the quiet confidence of a man who believed that excellence in his own domain would carry him forward regardless of who governed from Berlin. He was not entirely wrong. His years in the Reichswehr had produced something tangible. The tactical lectures he had delivered at the infantry school at Dresden had earned him a reputation as a gifted instructor, demanding, precise, and possessed of a rare ability to make complex maneuver feel intuitive to the young officers who sat before him. He had a way of reducing the chaos of battle to its essential components: speed, surprise, decision. Students remembered him not as a theorist who lingered in abstraction, but as a man who had walked through the fire himself and returned with hard-won answers. His classroom manner was direct to the point of severity, and he did not soften his assessments to spare feelings. When an officer reasoned poorly, Rommel said so. When one reasoned well, he acknowledged it with the same economy. Respect in his classroom was earned, and it was earned through demonstrated competence. The fruit of those lecture years was a manuscript. Over the course of several years, Rommel had assembled his combat experiences and tactical observations into a work that circulated first in draft form among officers and students before reaching a wider audience. Published in 1937 under the title Infantry Attacks, the book was neither polemic nor memoir in the conventional sense. It was a professional document, a case study in small unit leadership drawn from real engagements, real terrain, real consequences. It described how a junior officer might think in contact with the enemy, how to read ground and exploit hesitation, how to act when the map and the reality no longer matched. The book sold well beyond military circles, reaching a German public still half in love with the mythology of the great war soldier. It brought Rommel something he had not actively sought but would find useful: a name that civilians recognized. As the new regime began its program of rearmament in earnest, the German military expanded at a pace that would have been unthinkable under the restrictions of Versailles. New divisions were forming, new officer billets opening, and men who had spent years stalled in rank suddenly found themselves rising again. Rommel rose with them, though not merely as a beneficiary of expansion. He rose because those above him continued to regard him as exceptional. He was appointed to command an infantry battalion, then given broader responsibilities, each assignment confirming what his superiors already believed, that he was a natural commander, someone who imposed his will on situations rather than waiting for situations to clarify themselves. His subordinates responded to his energy. His superiors responded to his results. It was during this period that Rommel's trajectory began to intersect, tentatively at first, with the upper atmosphere of Nazi power. Hitler's government had moved quickly to bind the military to the state, and the traditional separation between the professional officer corps and political leadership was being compressed year by year. Rommel was not a party man, but he was not naive. He understood that the machinery of career advancement now ran through a Berlin where ideology and military competence were being woven together into something new. He navigated this carefully, projecting the image of a dedicated professional whose loyalty was to Germany and to the army, an image that, importantly, could be read in multiple ways by those watching from different sides of the divide. His growing prominence brought him to the attention of those managing the relationship between the Wehrmacht and Hitler's personal staff. He was assigned as a liaison officer between army units and Hitler's traveling headquarters during field exercises and ceremonial occasions, a role that required both military knowledge and a certain personal reliability. It was not glamorous work in the conventional sense, but it placed Rommel in proximity to Hitler himself, at a time when such proximity was rapidly becoming one of the most significant currencies in the German state. He was not the only capable officer in the army, but he was among those identified as trustworthy in both directions, trusted by the military to represent its interests professionally, and trusted by the political leadership to do so without embarrassing friction. Those who watched Rommel during this period noted something about the way he carried himself in Hitler's presence. He was not sycophantic, not in the manner of men who had built their careers on flattery and performed enthusiasm. He was respectful, direct, and businesslike, qualities that paradoxically made him more appealing to Hitler than the more obvious courtiers. Hitler had a complex relationship with the professional officer class, oscillating between contempt for its conservatism and craving for its legitimacy. Rommel occupied a narrow band that satisfied both impulses. He was unmistakably a fighting soldier, decorated and proven, and yet he carried none of the aristocratic disdain for political leadership that Hitler found infuriating in the Prussian generals who surrounded him. He was, in the language of the moment, approachable. By the middle years of the decade, Rommel was also spending time at Wiener Neustadt in Austria, where he served in an instructional capacity, and his range of contacts across the expanding German military widened further. He was a known quantity now, not famous in the way he would later become, but recognized within professional circles as someone moving in one direction only. His tactical reputation remained the bedrock. Officers who had trained under him or served beside him spoke of a commander who saw the battlefield several moves ahead, who made decisions at a tempo that left opponents perpetually off balance, and who expected his subordinates to do the same. He was not always easy to serve under. His standards were high, his patience for hesitation short, and his personal energy, even in his mid-40s, exhausting to those who had to keep pace with it. The assignment that crystallized his relationship with Hitler's circle came when he was selected to command the Führerbegleitkommando, the battalion tasked with protecting Hitler's person during field operations and public appearances. It was a role freighted with political significance that Rommel did not necessarily seek, but recognized as consequential. To command Hitler's personal protection was to be trusted absolutely, not merely professionally vetted, but personally vouched for, personally chosen. The position placed Rommel beside Hitler during the occupation of the Sudetenland in 1938, and then during the march into Czechoslovakia in 1939, operations conducted without combat, but with enormous political weight. He was present at the moments when Germany's borders expanded without a shot being fired, and he observed up close the way Hitler moved through those moments. The certainty, the crowd's adoration, the sense of destiny unchallenged. What Rommel made of Hitler during these years is a question that historians have examined from many angles without arriving at a single clean answer. His correspondence from the period reflects genuine admiration, though it is admiration filtered through the particular lens of a professional soldier looking at a political leader who had, at least so far, succeeded spectacularly. Germany was rearming, expanding, and winning without bleeding. From where Rommel stood, and with the information available to him, the political judgment appeared to be working. He was not, at this stage, someone who examined the ideology beneath the results, nor did he probe the methods by which minorities and dissidents were being handled in the interior. He was a soldier who looked at maps and outcomes. The map, in the late 1930s, still looked favorable. His relationship with both senior military figures and the Nazi leadership now gave him a position of unusual access. He was not yet a general of independent command, not yet the figure who would define campaigns across whole theaters of war, but he was being watched, assessed, and shaped by forces larger than himself, forces he did not fully control and perhaps did not fully understand. The rearmament years had taken a disciplined, talented infantry officer and transformed him into something the Wehrmacht had not quite seen before. A soldier with a public face, a literary reputation, a direct line to the Führer's staff, and tactical gifts that everyone from Berlin to the barracks acknowledged as exceptional. The ladder he had been climbing, rung by rung, exercise by exercise, lecture by lecture, had brought him to a landing he had not entirely planned for. Below him lay the career he had built with craft and patience. Above him, though he could not yet see its dimensions clearly, lay the war that would define everything that followed. Germany moved in September 1939, not with the cautious, grinding momentum of the last Great War, but with a velocity that left the world struggling to find language adequate enough to describe it. Poland, a nation that had existed in its modern form for barely 2 decades, found itself assaulted simultaneously from the west, the north, and the south. Within hours of the first shots, the strategic picture was already shifting faster than any traditional military command structure could process. For Erwin Rommel, who had spent the better part of the 1930s studying, teaching, and theorizing about mobile warfare while watching the Wehrmacht rearm around him, this was not merely a campaign. It was the first full-scale examination of everything he believed war could and should become. His role in Poland was not yet the one that would make him famous. He had not been given a Panzer Division to command. That would come. In September 1939, Rommel commanded Hitler's personal headquarters escort and accompaniment battalion, a position that placed him in close proximity to the Führer during the opening weeks of the campaign. It was, in purely military terms, not a frontline command, yet Rommel being Rommel, he refused to treat it as a ceremonial or administrative assignment. He used his position to observe, to study, and to press himself forward toward the action wherever the situation permitted. He was not a man who could stand behind glass and watch a war happen. He had to feel it, to absorb the tempo of it, to understand how the pieces actually moved when doctrine met reality at speed. What he witnessed in Poland confirmed instincts he had been refining for years. The Wehrmacht's armored and motorized formations did not simply punch through Polish lines. They bypassed them, encircled them, and rendered them irrelevant before they could be reinforced or resupplied. The Polish army, which was neither cowardly nor incompetent, found itself fighting a conflict shaped by an entirely different set of assumptions about time and space. Polish commanders expected to hold ground while reserves were brought up. German commanders, particularly those driving the armored spearheads, had no intention of giving them the time. Rommel watched these engagements with the focused attention of a man taking notes he intended to use. He had written about this kind of warfare. Now he was watching it live, and it was even more decisive than the theory had suggested. His proximity to Hitler during this period is a fact historians have turned over many times. It placed him at the center of the regime's self-congratulation during the campaign's swift progress, and it gave him a visibility that few officers of his rank could claim. Whether Rommel cultivated this closeness for personal advancement or simply performed his assigned duties with characteristic professionalism is a question that resists a clean answer. What is certain is that he was noticed. He made impressions. His directness, his evident physical courage, his obvious desire to be closer to the fighting than his role technically required. These qualities registered with those around him, including those at the very top of the command hierarchy. In a system increasingly dominated by political loyalty and factional maneuvering, Rommel's brand of unambiguous soldierly energy stood out. The Polish campaign itself was concluded with a speed that shocked the Western democracies watching from a careful distance. Within weeks, organized Polish resistance had effectively collapsed under the combined weight of the German assault from the west and the Soviet invasion that came from the east. Warsaw held longer than the rest of the country, its defenders fighting with a tenacity that impressed even those attacking it. But the strategic outcome was never genuinely in doubt after the first several days. The question was never whether Poland would fall, but how completely and how quickly. For the Wehrmacht, the campaign validated doctrines that had been developed, argued over, and refined during the 1930s. For Rommel personally, it crystallized a conviction that would define the next 3 years of his life, that speed, boldness, and the willingness to accept risk in pursuit of decisive action were not reckless qualities. They were the defining qualities of modern military success. He returned from Poland with something more valuable than medals, though those came as well. He returned with confirmed belief. The theoretical framework he had constructed over years of study and teaching had been tested against actual combat conditions and had not collapsed. Combined arms, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power working in close coordination and moving faster than an enemy could respond, worked. The potential of armored warfare was not a peacetime intellectual exercise. It was a practical and lethal method of deciding battles and campaigns before an opponent could mount a coherent reply. Rommel had understood this in principle. Poland made him certain of it in practice. Almost immediately after the Polish campaign concluded, Rommel began pressing through whatever channels were available to him for command of a Panzer Division. His request was unconventional. Infantry generals did not typically transition to armored command without having spent years inside the armored branch's own organizational culture. The Panzer Arm had its own traditions, its own language, its own way of understanding war. Rommel was not from that world. His background was in infantry, in the close terrain fighting of mountain passes and forest clearings, in the small unit tactics he had practiced and perfected during the First World War, and written about in the years after it. The armored establishment had its own candidates for divisional command, its own preferences and internal hierarchies. Rommel's ambition therefore required something beyond professional qualifications. It required influence at a level most infantry generals could not access. That influence existed, and Rommel used it. His position during the Polish campaign, his close proximity to Hitler's traveling headquarters, and the personal impression he had made on the Führer combined to give him a channel that bypassed the conventional promotion machinery. It was not the last time that Rommel's relationship with the highest levels of the Nazi regime would grant him opportunities that his professional peers resented and his institutional superiors could not easily block. When command of the 7th Panzer Division was confirmed, there were officers within the armored branch who received the news with something less than enthusiasm. An infantryman, regardless of his reputation for tactical innovation and personal bravery, was being handed one of the Army's most modern and prestigious formations. The grumbling was real, and it was not entirely without professional logic. Rommel spent the months between the end of the Polish campaign and the opening of the Western Offensive in May 1940, learning everything his new command required as fast as he could absorb it. He was not a man who arrived anywhere and coasted. He threw himself into the mechanics and the doctrine of armored warfare with the same compulsive energy he had brought to every other challenge in his career. He interrogated his own officers. He studied the division's equipment in technical detail. He worked to understand the particular rhythms of armored operations, the way fuel consumption shaped operational planning, the way tank crews experienced battle differently from infantry, the way communication between moving vehicles changed the fundamental calculus of command and control. He was, in the most literal sense, educating himself at speed under time pressure. What made this period remarkable was not simply that Rommel adapted quickly, though he did. It was that he adapted while simultaneously reshaping the division's culture around his own instincts. The 7th Panzer Division, under its previous commanders, had been a competent formation. Under Rommel, it began to develop something additional, an expectation of aggression, of forward momentum, of command from the front rather than from the rear. Rommel made clear, through everything he did, that he intended to lead from beside and occasionally ahead of his lead elements, not from a headquarters safely removed from the contact point. This was not a performance of bravado. It was a considered tactical philosophy. He believed, and would continue to believe until the end of his operational career, that a commander who could see the battle as it was actually unfolding, rather than as it had been reported 30 minutes earlier through a series of signal layers, held an irreplaceable advantage. Maps and reports described the past. The front described the present. By the time the spring of 1940 approached, the division he commanded was something genuinely distinctive within the Wehrmacht order of battle. Not necessarily the best equipped or the most experienced, the armored veterans from before his arrival could claim more time inside the technical culture of the Panzer Arm. But the division carried an expectation that it would move fast, that it would accept uncertainty rather than wait for it to resolve, and that its commander would be present in the decisive moment rather than managing from a distance. That expectation had been created in the space of months. It would be tested almost immediately, on roads leading into Belgium and France, in a campaign that would astonish the world in ways even Poland had not quite prepared it for. Rommel had spent his career preparing for a moment like this. He did not know it was coming in precisely the form it would take, but he had made himself ready, and the division he commanded was ready with him. What had worked in Poland would be refined in France, but refinement, for Erwin Rommel, was never a gentle process. It was a violent acceleration, a compression of time and distance into something that left opponents not merely defeated, but bewildered. When the German offensive in the West began in the early hours of the 10th of May 1940, Rommel sat behind his command vehicle somewhere near the Belgian border, studying maps he had already committed to memory. The 7th Panzer Division was his instrument now, a force built around armored vehicles, motorized infantry, and artillery that could move together as a single fist rather than the separated, plodding columns of the previous war. He understood intuitively what many senior commanders still debated in conference rooms. The tank was not a support weapon for infantry. Infantry was support for the tank, and he intended to prove it. The plan assigned to Army Group A, the main thrust through the Ardennes, was audacious to the point of recklessness in the estimation of its critics. Conventional wisdom held that the dense forest and narrow roads of the Ardennes were impassable for armored formations of any significant size. Rommel held no particular affection for conventional wisdom. His division crossed the Meuse River at Dinant in Belgium, at a point the Allied command had not prioritized because they had not believed armor could arrive there quickly enough to matter. They were wrong. The crossing was contested and costly, requiring bridging operations conducted under fire, with Rommel himself appearing at the riverbank to supervise directly. He did not observe from a comfortable distance. He walked among his engineers. He positioned himself where men could see him, not to perform courage, but because he genuinely understood that visible command accelerated decisions, and speed of decision was the only currency he recognized. Once across the Meuse, the 7th Panzer moved with a velocity that fractured the coherent picture Allied commanders were trying to assemble. Headquarters at all levels began receiving reports that placed Rommel's division simultaneously in locations that seemed geographically impossible to reconcile. The French and British commanders were working from a mental model of the previous war, in which advances were measured in hundreds of meters per day, and lines of communication were carefully established before further movement proceeded. Rommel was advancing tens of kilometers per day, sometimes more, not pausing to secure flanks, not waiting for permission from Corps or Army headquarters, moving his command post forward so aggressively that he was frequently ahead of his own rear elements. Communications back to higher command became sporadic. This was not a malfunction. For Rommel, it was a method. It was during this phase of the campaign that the 7th Panzer earned the name that would follow it into history. French and British staff officers, attempting to track the division's movements on situation maps, kept losing it. It would disappear from one sector of the line and reappear, hours later, in a position that ought to have taken days to reach. Prisoners could not reliably describe where they had been captured in relation to known reference points. Supply officers from neighboring German units reported the 7th Panzer pressing through areas that had not yet been cleared. The division seemed to materialize and vanish at will, like something that existed only in rumor. Someone called it the Ghost Division. The name traveled quickly through military communications on both sides, and it stayed. Rommel's personal command style during this campaign is worth examining in detail, because it deviated sharply from the doctrine that most general officers of any nation considered professionally sound. He rode with the leading elements. He sat in the turret of an armored vehicle or stood in an open staff car, moving through country that had not yet been secured. He made decisions at the front, based on what he saw rather than what reports told him, hours after the fact, back at a fixed command post. There were moments when his division's spearhead was so far forward that Rommel himself was briefly out of contact with both his superior commanders and his own rear elements, moving through a military vacuum between German advance and Allied collapse. Officers who served under him recalled that this was simultaneously exhilarating and unnerving. He demanded that his commanders match his tempo. Those who hesitated, who waited for confirmation before acting, who sought written orders before committing forces, found themselves quietly relieved. He had no patience for hesitation dressed up as prudence. The campaign moved through Belgium and into France, with a logic that began to feel less like strategy and more like avalanche. By late May of 1940, the British Expeditionary Force and significant portions of the French army had been pushed toward the Channel coast, their retreat becoming increasingly desperate as German armored formations cut the roads behind them. Rommel's division was among those pressing northward, and at several points during these days it encountered Allied columns attempting to retreat in good order. The encounters were brutal and sudden, armored vehicles appearing from unexpected directions, the careful geometry of organized withdrawal dissolving into chaotic movement. The psychological weight of this was as significant as the physical. An army that does not know where the enemy is or where safety lies begins to make decisions from fear rather than calculation. Rommel had understood this since his days as a junior officer in the mountains of the Carpathians. Create confusion, sustain it, and let the confusion fight on your behalf. He was not invulnerable. There were moments during the French campaign when the 7th Panzer absorbed punishment that would have broken a less driven formation. Counterattacks by French armored units, in some instances deploying tanks that were heavier and more heavily armored than anything Rommel's division fielded, inflicted genuine casualties and forced brief defensive consolidations. British forces near Arras launched a local counterattack in late May that struck the southern flank of the German advance, with enough weight to cause temporary alarm at several command levels. Rommel responded with characteristic directness. He moved toward the crisis rather than managing it from behind, directing anti-tank guns into position himself, stabilizing the line through the force of his presence as much as through tactical adjustment. The counterattack was eventually contained, but it was a reminder that speed alone was not armor against all outcomes. The fall of France accelerated through June of 1940, with a momentum that surprised even those who had planned the offensive. Paris was declared an open city. The French government negotiated. The British completed their evacuation from Dunkirk, having escaped across the Channel in extraordinary numbers, but leaving behind the heavy equipment that an army in the field requires to fight. Rommel's division, by the time the armistice was signed in late June of 1940, had covered more than 300 kilometers in roughly 6 weeks of active operations, had captured tens of thousands of prisoners, and had done so with supply lines and communications that its commander had frequently treated as secondary concerns to forward momentum. The butcher's bill for this achievement was real and recorded. But what mattered to the German public and to the propaganda apparatus that shaped their understanding was the speed and the completeness of the victory. Rommel understood public perception as well as he understood maneuver warfare. He had been photographing his own campaign since Poland, carrying a camera in his command vehicle, composing images that showed leadership, movement, and triumph. During the French campaign, these photographs became a record that would eventually reach civilian and military audiences alike, reinforcing the image of a commander who led from the front, shared danger with his men, and embodied the aggressive modernity that German military propaganda was so eager to project. He was not manufacturing a persona cynically. He genuinely led from the front, but he was also aware that what soldiers and nations believed about their commanders mattered to the outcome of wars, and he did nothing to discourage the legend that was forming around his name. By the time the French campaign concluded, Rommel was among the most discussed German commanders of the war. He had been promoted. He had received decorations beyond those awarded after Poland. He had attracted the personal attention and expressed admiration of Hitler himself, which in the political architecture of the Third Reich was a form of protection and a form of danger simultaneously. Senior officers who had watched his unconventional methods with skepticism now had to reconcile their professional reservations with the fact that his results had been extraordinary. His superiors in the chain of command had, on multiple occasions during the campaign, lost contact with him entirely because he had moved too far forward too quickly. This had frustrated them. It had also worked. Those two facts sat in uncomfortable proximity, and the military establishment of Germany was not entirely sure what to do with them. What Rommel himself felt in these weeks was, by all subsequent accounts, something close to vindication. The tactical philosophy he had developed across 3 decades of study and service, the conviction that speed and aggression and personal leadership at the point of contact were worth more than careful preparation and centralized control, had been put to the most demanding possible test and had returned a verdict he considered unambiguous. France, one of the great military powers of Europe, had been defeated in weeks. A campaign that the previous generation had fought for 4 years without resolution had been concluded in less than 2 months. He had been part of that, centrally and visibly, and he knew it. The ghost had been very real and very fast, and it had won. What he did not yet know, could not yet know, was that the conditions of the French campaign were nearly perfect for the kind of warfare he fought best. He had faced an enemy whose command structure was fragile, whose doctrine was slow, and whose political will had cracked under the first sustained pressure. He had operated over terrain suited to armor, with his flanks ultimately secure within the broader German advance, and with supply routes that, however stretched, had not required him to fight across an ocean of desert for every liter of fuel. France had proved everything he believed about war. North Africa would test whether those beliefs held when the conditions were far less kind. The Italian ally faced collapse. In North Africa, the grand ambitions of fascism had withered under the pressure of British mechanized forces. By the beginning of 1941, Italian armies that had once promised dominion over Libya and Egypt had been driven backward across the desert in a humiliating retreat. The British, under commanders like Richard O'Connor, had shattered Italian formations with speed and precision, leaving Rome desperate and demanding German assistance. Hitler, occupied with preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union, had little appetite for Middle Eastern adventures. Yet he could not afford the loss of his Italian partner, weakened and frightened as it now was. The solution came in the form of a single Panzer Division and a general of exceptional gifts. Erwin Rommel was not the first choice for the position. He was young for such a command, still climbing the ladder of the German military hierarchy. But his reputation from the French campaign, His audacity, his willingness to think beyond conventional doctrine, his ability to achieve victory with limited means, made him the obvious choice for an impossible task. In February 1941, he arrived in Tripoli with instructions to stabilize the North African front and prevent further Italian losses. What he found was chaos. The Italians possessed superior numbers, but they were demoralized, poorly equipped, and accustomed to defeat. Supply lines were fragile. Air superiority belonged to the British. The German forces at his disposal were modest by the standards of his past campaigns. And yet within weeks, Rommel would transform the situation entirely, would seize the initiative, and would begin an assault on the British position that would consume the next 3 years of the North African War. Rommel's first weeks in Libya were not spent in grand offensive maneuvers, but in observation and assessment. He traveled the desert, spoke with Italian commanders, examined the terrain, and evaluated the strength and disposition of British forces. What he discovered was that the British, having inflicted their overwhelming defeat on the Italians, had themselves paused to consolidate and regroup. They had drawn their forces back into prepared positions. This pause, this moment of hesitation, represented opportunity. Rommel understood immediately that the British would expect him to remain cautious, to build up his strength, to wait for reinforcements and supplies before attempting anything ambitious. They had not yet encountered him in Africa. They did not yet understand that patience was not among his virtues. He began forming plans for offensive action almost immediately, plans that alarmed some of his Italian allies and confused his superiors back in Berlin, who expected him to play a purely defensive role. The terrain of North Africa demanded a complete recalibration of how Rommel had conducted warfare in Europe. The desert offered no forests to provide cover, no urban terrain to break up an opponent's movement, no rivers to serve as defensive barriers. It was instead an open expanse where visibility stretched to the horizon on clear days, where columns of vehicles could be spotted from great distances, where speed and flexibility became the dominant currencies of military exchange. The Italians had never learned to exploit these conditions. They had fought in the desert as though it were Europe, relying on static positions and linear defensive lines that invited encirclement. Rommel grasped immediately that in this landscape, the side with superior mobility, with willingness to strike into the open desert rather than along coastal roads, with ability to appear where the enemy did not expect, held decisive advantage. He began to organize his forces around this principle, regardless of their small numbers compared to what British and Italian forces could muster. In March 1941, Rommel launched his first offensive. The operation was limited in scope. He was not yet ready for a major assault, but it achieved exactly what he intended. German columns, moving with characteristic speed and aggression, struck at British positions near the Gulf of Sirte. The British, accustomed to operating against static Italian defenders, found themselves facing an opponent who attacked with precision and withdrew with equal speed. Rommel's forces probed their defenses, tested their reactions, and retreated before the British could bring their superior numbers to bear. These initial skirmishes were tactically modest but strategically significant. They proved to the Italians that the Germans were not content with mere stability. They demonstrated to the British that a new kind of warfare had come to the desert, and they gave Rommel the intelligence he needed to plan larger operations. Throughout the spring of 1941, Rommel's audacity accelerated. He began launching operations that surprised his own headquarters in Berlin. The German High Command, preoccupied with the forthcoming invasion of the Soviet Union, had authorized him to stabilize the front and perhaps conduct limited offensive operations. Instead, Rommel was planning something far grander. He requested reinforcements, pushed for additional supplies, and argued that the moment existed to seize the initiative entirely from the British and drive them out of Libya. His communications with Berlin reveal the essential tension between his ambitions and his superiors' more modest expectations. Hitler and the General Staff viewed North Africa as a secondary theater. Rommel saw in it the opportunity to strike a decisive blow against British power in the Mediterranean. He was a commander possessed by his vision of what might be achieved, and he began to bend his orders to match his ambitions. The Italian High Command found itself caught between the Germans and the reality of the Desert War. The Italian commanders respected Rommel's aggressive spirit, but feared the consequences of overextension. They cautioned him against moving too far beyond his supply lines, against spreading his forces too thinly, against the risk of a British counteroffensive that might shatter him as it had shattered them. Yet they also recognized that the arrival of the German general and his Panzer Division had already transformed the situation. Where there had been collapse, there was now stability. Where there had been despair, there was now at least the possibility of resistance. The Italians, humbled by their previous defeats, generally deferred to Rommel's military judgment. His confidence was contagious. He seemed to possess a certainty about what could be achieved in the desert that communicated itself to every level of command beneath him. By May 1941, Rommel had assembled sufficient force and ammunition to attempt something far larger than his initial probes. He launched a major offensive against the British positions in Cyrenaica. The operation demonstrated every principle that he had learned in France and adapted to desert conditions. German columns moved with extraordinary speed, crossing terrain that the British believed impassable for mechanized forces. The panzer regiments executed coordinated maneuvers that caught British units in crossfire and prevented their concentration. Artillery was positioned with precision to break up British attempts to stand and fight. Where resistance was encountered, Rommel applied pressure not head-on but through flanking movements that threatened encirclement. The British, despite possessing greater numbers of tanks and vehicles, found themselves outmaneuvered and pushed backward. The speed of the advance stunned observers on both sides. Rommel's forces, totaling perhaps fewer than 5,000 troops with supporting armor, were advancing against British forces that numbered in the tens of thousands. Yet through superior coordination, through exploitation of the open terrain, through willingness to accept risk that more cautious commanders would have rejected, Rommel drove the British eastward. Supply became an increasing problem. The further he advanced, the thinner his supply lines stretched. But he did not allow this material constraint to slow his offensive momentum. He accepted the risk of operating far beyond his supply bases, because he understood that the psychological effect of rapid advance, the appearance of German strength and invincibility, was itself a form of weaponry. The British, remembering their recent victories and then experiencing sudden reversal, began to pull back faster than tactical situations alone would have dictated. By June 1941, Rommel had driven the British out of most of Cyrenaica and positioned himself at the gates of Tobruk, a fortified port city that the British had taken from the Italians and now held as their major supply and operational base in Libya. The speed of his advance had left Berlin astonished. His superiors had expected him to conduct a careful, limited campaign. Instead, he had transformed the entire strategic situation in North Africa within 4 months of his arrival. The British position, which had seemed secure and threatening just weeks before, had been reduced to isolated garrisons. Only Tobruk, defended by substantial forces and supplied by sea, represented a significant British presence. Rommel immediately began planning how to reduce it, how to drive the final blow that would sweep the British out of Libya entirely. He reported to Berlin with undisguised confidence that total victory in North Africa lay within reach. Yet even as Rommel's star rose, the foundations of his success contained weaknesses that would later prove fatal. The supply problem that he had accepted as manageable in spring would become increasingly severe as his lines of communication stretched across hundreds of kilometers of desert. His forces, however brilliantly commanded, were still relatively small and could not simply overwhelm British and American reinforcements through sheer weight of numbers. The Italian forces that fought alongside him, while improving under German example, remained constrained by equipment and morale. And his relationship with Hitler, previously uncomplicated, was beginning to complicate as the German leader's attention turned increasingly eastward toward the Soviet Union and away from North Africa. For now, in the intoxication of success, these future problems seemed manageable. Rommel had arrived in Libya as a general tasked with stabilization. He was departing his first campaign there as the architect of an apparent transformation, a military figure whose name was beginning to be spoken in the same breath as the great commanders of military history. The North African theater, which had seemed a backwater when Rommel was assigned to it, had suddenly become the stage where his reputation would be made and, eventually, unmade. The British, whose commanders had celebrated their victories over Italy just weeks before, now faced an opponent of entirely different caliber. The Italians, whose forces had collapsed under earlier pressure, had found in Rommel a commander who believed that the desert could be mastered, that mobility could overcome numbers, that boldness could win victories that caution could never achieve. For the German High Command, preoccupied with the vast campaign about to begin in Russia, North Africa remained a secondary concern. But Rommel had other ideas. He had tasted initial success in a landscape unlike any he had previously encountered. He had identified in the desert a theater where his particular gifts, rapid maneuver, tactical flexibility, aggressive exploitation of advantage, could achieve results that seemed almost miraculous. By the summer of 1941, the die had been cast. The Great Desert Campaign, the campaign that would consume the next 3 years and forge Rommel's legend as the Desert Fox, had truly begun. When Erwin Rommel arrived in Libya in early February 1941, he carried with him not maps or grand strategic plans, but a singular conviction. The British forces arrayed against him were vulnerable to speed, to audacity, and to the kind of mobile warfare that had worked so devastatingly in France. The Italian forces already in North Africa were exhausted and demoralized. Their commanders, accustomed to the grinding, static campaigns of earlier eras, saw themselves as merely holding ground until reinforcements arrived from Europe. Rommel thought differently. Within weeks of his arrival, he began to sense an opportunity that his Italian allies could not see. The British, though numerically superior in some categories, were spread across vast distances. Their supply lines were stretched. Their command structure, though competent, moved with the caution of an empire that had not fought a peer opponent in decades. Rommel understood what few military minds of his generation fully grasped, that in the desert, distance became a weapon as lethal as any anti-tank gun. The first weeks of Rommel's command in Libya were consumed not by grand maneuvers, but by the mundane and maddening work of logistics. Every truck mattered. Every drop of fuel was counted. The ports of Tripoli and Benghazi existed as lifelines across thousands of kilometers of sea, controlled by the British Royal Navy and its aircraft. Supply officers in Berlin and Rome could scarcely comprehend the scale of the challenge. Rommel, however, grasped it instantly and completely. Yet instead of accepting these constraints as limiting factors, he began to see them as problems to be solved through aggressive action. If he could move quickly enough, strike decisively enough, and maintain momentum, he reasoned, he might achieve operational success before his supply situation deteriorated beyond recovery. It was a philosophy born from desperation and audacity in equal measure, and it would define his entire North African campaign. By the end of February 1941, reconnaissance reports indicated that the British forces under General Philip Niem were thin on the ground and relatively immobile. Their tanks were distributed across Cyrenaica in a loosely connected defensive posture. Rommel seized upon this intelligence like a predator recognizing wounded prey. Against the counsel of more cautious voices in the Italian command structure, he began positioning his forces for an offensive operation. The orders from Berlin were theoretically clear. Hold the line, stabilize the Italian sector, prepare for future operations when reinforcements arrived. But Rommel had never been a commander who allowed distant orders to constrain his tactical vision when the situation on the ground demanded action. He began moving forces eastward through the Libyan desert in early March, his columns racing across the harsh, monotonous terrain with a speed that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The offensive that began on the 4th of March 1941 was launched with forces that seemed inadequate on paper. The Afrika Korps under Rommel's immediate command consisted of the 5th Light Division, the 15th Panzer Division in the early stages of arrival, and supporting Italian units that ranged from capable to questionable in terms of mobility and combat effectiveness. The British forces in Cyrenaica numbered perhaps 40,000 soldiers with significant tank strength, substantially more than what Rommel could deploy. Yet numbers alone have never decided battles, and Rommel understood this principle more intuitively than almost any commander of his era. Speed, concentration, surprise, and the ability to move faster than an opponent's ability to react or reinforce. These were the true coinages of desert warfare. The advance began in two prongs. One column drove directly eastward toward the British positions around Marmarica, while another swept through the desert to the south, attempting to envelop and cut off the British forces from their lines of retreat. British commanders found themselves facing a tactical dilemma that their training and experience had not adequately prepared them for. Rommel's columns appeared where they were not supposed to be. His armored units bypassed strong points rather than assaulting them directly. His reconnaissance elements probed constantly, searching for weak points and gaps in the British defensive line. Within days, the British command began to realize that they were facing an opponent who did not fight according to the conventional playbook. The British 9th Division, under Major General John Mackay, found itself increasingly isolated as Rommel's forces moved around and behind British positions. Rather than stand and fight a battle of attrition that he was prepared to lose, Mackay made the decision to withdraw eastward toward Tobruk. This choice, made under extreme pressure and with limited visibility into Rommel's full intentions, proved momentous. The British retreat was not disorderly. Mackay maintained discipline and cohesion during the pullback, but it was a retreat nonetheless. For Rommel, each day of advance brought fresh tactical opportunities and fresh strategic dilemmas. The further east he drove, the longer his supply lines became. Yet the momentum of his offensive and the continuing British withdrawal suggested that even greater victories lay within reach if only he could maintain the offensive's impetus. By mid-March, Rommel's forces had advanced roughly 120 kilometers from their starting positions. The port of Benghazi, a significant supply depot and symbol of Axis presence in Libya, fell into German hands. The capture of Benghazi was not militarily decisive, but it was symbolically important, both to Rommel's troops and to the distant leaders in Berlin and Rome, who suddenly perceived their commander in Libya not as a holding force, but as a man capable of offensive operations. Reports filtered back to Hitler's headquarters, describing an energetic German general who understood mobile warfare in a way that few others seemed to grasp. These reports were not entirely displeasing to Hitler, though they raised questions about whether Rommel was operating within the scope of his original mandate. The British continued their retreat eastward, and Rommel drove them deeper into Egypt, pursuing with a relentlessness that British officers found both admirable and unnerving. By the end of March, barely 3 weeks after his offensive began, Rommel's forces had advanced approximately 300 kilometers. The British had been driven from Cyrenaica, their carefully prepared positions outflanked and abandoned. Rommel's personal leadership style, his willingness to expose himself to danger at the forward edge of battle, began to create legends among his men and respect among his enemies. Stories circulated of the general driving alone in his scout car far ahead of his main forces, directly observing the terrain and the enemy positions. These stories were not entirely myth. Rommel did in fact operate in this manner, gathering information directly rather than relying solely on reports from subordinates. Yet beneath the operational success lay a growing strategic problem. Hitler's headquarters in Berlin remained ambivalent about Rommel's operations. The original assignment had been defensive, to shore up the Italian sector and prevent further British advances. Rommel had transformed this into an offensive campaign that was consuming resources and pushing into operational areas for which he had not secured formal authorization. The Oberkommando des Heeres, the German Army High Command, found itself receiving constant requests from Rommel for additional resources, reinforcements, and supplies. These requests came alongside reports of his advancing positions and his apparent tactical successes. The situation created a persistent tension between Berlin's caution and Rommel's ambitions that would characterize his entire North African command. As April began, Rommel's attention fixed on Tobruk, a fortified port city that lay approximately 110 kilometers from the Egyptian border. The British had occupied and fortified Tobruk months earlier as part of their defensive strategy in the western desert. Now it appeared as an isolated fortress, surrounded by Axis forces and cut off from direct supply by sea due to the British Navy's dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Tobruk represented both an opportunity and an obstacle. Its capture would give Rommel a significant port facility for supply and resupply. Its continued existence as a British-held position threatened to become an irritant to his operational success. Rommel decided to push on toward the fortress and attempt its capture, though the magnitude of this undertaking would only become apparent in the ensuing months. The advance to Tobruk in late March and early April 1941 represented the high point of Rommel's first offensive campaign in North Africa. British forces under General Archibald Wavell, who held overall command in the Middle East, faced a situation that seemed to deteriorate with each passing day. A commander who had previously held the initiative in North Africa now found himself reacting to an opponent's moves, rather than dictating the pace and nature of operations. The distance between Wavell's headquarters in Cairo and the forward areas of combat meant that orders often arrived hours or even days after circumstances had shifted dramatically. Intelligence reports indicated that the German general in Libya was unlike any commander the British had previously encountered in this theater. He moved quickly, struck decisively, and seemed to care little for the conventional rules of military propriety regarding supply lines, defensive positions, and operational boundaries. By the second week of April, Rommel's forces had invested Tobruk and begun probing its defenses. The British garrison, under the command of Major General Ronald Scobie, held approximately 25,000 soldiers, supported by tanks, artillery, and a network of defensive positions that would prove far more formidable than either Rommel or British commanders had initially anticipated. The initial assault on Tobruk's perimeter was repulsed with heavy casualties to the attacking forces. Rommel found himself facing a problem he had not encountered in his triumphant advance across Cyrenaica, a well-fortified position manned by determined defenders who could not be outmaneuvered because they were, by definition, already surrounded. Yet in the very failure to capture Tobruk quickly lay a deeper strategic reality that Rommel was only beginning to comprehend. His supply lines now extended hundreds of kilometers across desert terrain. The further he advanced, the greater the logistical demands placed upon limited German resources. Berlin's initial ambivalence about his offensive operations was beginning to harden into genuine concern about whether he had overextended himself. Meanwhile, the British, shocked by the speed and audacity of his advance, were already working to prepare counteroffensives and to gather reinforcements for a return to the offensive. The stage was being set for a prolonged struggle that neither Rommel nor his opponents could have fully imagined in those triumphant early days of April 1941. By the spring of 1941, Erwin Rommel stood at the threshold of something that had eluded him throughout his career, not merely tactical success, but strategic triumph. His lightning advance across Cyrenaica had shattered the British Eastern Force, scattered their formations across the desert, and sent their senior commanders scrambling to reorganize what remained of their battered command. The 7th Panzer Division and the 5th Light Division, fighting with a cohesion and aggressiveness their British counterparts found bewildering, had driven eastward with such speed that the conquest of Libya seemed less a military campaign and more a demonstration of superior will and imagination. Yet standing before him now, Perched on the Mediterranean coast like a thorn in his advancing hand, sat Tobruk. The port city, heavily fortified and garrisoned by Commonwealth forces, refused to yield. What began as an inconvenient delay in April 1941 would become a nightmare that consumed his time, his resources, and increasingly his political standing. Tobruk was not a conventional fortress in the medieval sense. It was a modern military harbor protected by a ring of anti-tank obstacles, gun emplacements, and interconnected defensive positions constructed by British and Italian engineers over years of Mediterranean military planning. The port itself remained vital, not merely as a symbolic prize, but as the only deep-water harbor between Benghazi and Alexandria, and whoever controlled it held the logistical advantage in the entire theater. For Rommel, capturing Tobruk represented the final step in consolidating his hold on Cyrenaica and establishing a springboard for further operations eastward into Egypt. For the British, holding it meant preserving a vital supply node and maintaining a foothold from which to launch future counteroffensives. This collision of strategic imperatives transformed what might have been a straightforward siege into a grinding, attritional struggle that would define the entire North African campaign and expose the fundamental weaknesses in German logistics that would ultimately defeat Rommel far more decisively than any British general. The garrison at Tobruk was formidable. Commanded by Major General Ronald Scobie, the fortress held approximately 35,000 troops, primarily from the Australian 2nd Division, supported by British gunners, South African units, and various support personnel. They were well supplied with anti-tank guns, artillery pieces, and ammunition stockpiles that British convoys had delivered during the previous months. The defensive perimeter stretched roughly 9 miles, protected by minefields, anti-tank ditches, and a network of gun pits and fortified positions. Within this barrier sat troops who, despite the shock of Rommel's initial offensive, had rallied and organized themselves with the characteristic stubborn determination that Commonwealth forces would demonstrate repeatedly throughout the Desert War. They had no intention of surrendering, and Rommel, assessing the situation with brutal clarity, understood that starving them out or crushing them through frontal assault would require sustained operations that his logistical situation could barely support. Here lay the paradox at the heart of Rommel's predicament. His tactical and operational brilliance had carried him far, perhaps too far. He had advanced across the desert with such speed that his supply lines, already stretched across hundreds of kilometers of desert terrain, dependent on the Italian transport network, began to collapse under the weight of supporting 2 divisions locked in siege warfare. The Afrika Korps required fuel, ammunition, food, water, and replacement vehicles and personnel in quantities that the fragile supply chain connecting Tripoli through Benghazi and into Cyrenaica could not reliably deliver. British submarines and aircraft operating from Egypt and from Malta, that unsinkable carrier in the middle of the Mediterranean, harassed every convoy attempting to cross the sea route from Italy. The Luftwaffe, while present in North Africa, lacked the strength to guarantee safe passage or provide sustained air support to ground operations. Rommel found himself in the position of a general who had won every tactical engagement, but was slowly strangling himself through the very success of his advance. The assault on Tobruk began in earnest in April 1941, though the siege would continue, in various intensities, until the following year. Rommel threw his divisions against the perimeter in waves, attempting to find weakness in the British-built defenses. The 21st Panzer Regiment and supporting infantry battalions attacked with the same aggressive style that had worked so effectively against mobile enemy forces in open desert. But Tobruk was not the open desert. Within the fortress, the defenders had prepared killing grounds with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery and anti-tank guns inflicted steady losses on attacking German and Italian formations. The Afrika Korps, designed for rapid maneuver and exploitation, found itself engaged in static siege warfare that demanded different skills, different tactics, and a willingness to accept casualties that its logistical situation could barely sustain. After the initial assaults failed to breach the perimeter, Rommel shifted to a strategy of containment and attrition, accepting that Tobruk would remain an obstinate problem that required constant attention and resources. What made Tobruk especially maddening for Rommel was the gap between his ambitions and his means. He understood that with secure supply lines and reinforcements, he could break through to Suez and potentially strike at the Nile Delta, threatening Britain's entire position in the Middle East. He wrote reports to his superiors, to Field Marshal Erwin von Rundstedt at German Army headquarters, to the Quartermaster General, to anyone who might listen, outlining the strategic opportunity before him. Tobruk was not the end goal, it was merely the gateway. Yet with each passing month, as the garrison held firm and his own strength was siphoned away into the attrition of siege operations, the gateway remained closed. Hitler and the German High Command focused primarily on the invasion of the Soviet Union, which commenced in June 1941, offered only tepid support. Rommel received occasional reinforcements and promises of supplies that rarely materialized in the quantities he requested. The Mediterranean was becoming an increasingly dangerous place for Axis convoys as British air and sea power intensified. He was being forced to wage a campaign of attrition at precisely the moment when he lacked the reserves for attrition. The months from May through August 1941 represented the first real crisis of the Afrika Korps. Rommel's offensive capability, which had seemed boundless in the spring, gradually contracted. His formations were reorganized to reflect the losses they had sustained. Commanders reported that tank strength was declining, that ammunition stocks were being carefully rationed, and that the morale of German troops, though still excellent, showed the first signs of strain. The Italian forces under Marshal Ettore Bastico, Rommel's nominal superior but a man with whom he shared only tension and mutual distrust, offered little meaningful assistance. The Italian army in North Africa was itself struggling with supply shortages and organizational difficulties that made coordinating large-scale operations with the Germans increasingly complicated. Rommel, accustomed to operating independently and making rapid decisions without extensive consultation, chafed at the political and logistical constraints that increasingly bound him. By autumn 1941, stalemate had settled over North Africa. Tobruk remained unaken. British forces under newly arrived commanders had stabilized their position and begun preparing for counteroffensives. Rommel's advance had not only stopped but begun to show signs of reversal. In November 1941, the British launched Operation Crusader, a major offensive designed to relieve Tobruk and drive German forces westward. The fighting was fierce and mobile, ranging across hundreds of square kilometers of desert terrain. For a brief moment, Rommel seemed to recover his initiative, concentrating his armor and threatening to encircle and destroy British mobile forces. Yet attrition and supply shortages again worked against him. After weeks of grinding combat, with both sides suffering severe casualties and equipment losses, Rommel was forced to withdraw westward. Tobruk, after months of siege, was relieved by British forces breaking through from the east. The fortress remained in Commonwealth hands, and Rommel's offensive momentum, apparently so unstoppable only months earlier, had shattered against the combined obstacles of an impenetrable fortress, a revitalizing enemy command, and the cruel mathematics of desert logistics. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. Rommel had never before faced sustained failure in the field. Throughout his career in the Great War, and subsequently, he had found a way to maneuver, to exploit weakness, to achieve his objectives through superior tactics and aggressive decision-making. Tobruk had resisted him. The fortress had mocked his speed and aggressiveness by simply refusing to fall, despite his best efforts. More troubling still was the growing realization that the war in North Africa might not be winnable for Germany if the British could sustain their supply lines and bring increasing resources to bear against him. He was beginning to understand, though he could not yet articulate it fully, that his operational brilliance was being strangled by strategic limitations beyond his control. Hitler's focus on the Soviet Union meant that the Mediterranean theater would never receive the resources it demanded. The Italian Navy could not provide the escorting firepower necessary to protect convoys from British attack. The German Luftwaffe in North Africa lacked the numerical strength to dominate the skies. Against a resolute enemy growing stronger each month, Rommel found himself fighting with materiel that was being consumed faster than it could be replaced. The period from late 1941 through early 1942 represented a strange interregnum. Both sides prepared for renewed offensives. Rommel received limited reinforcements, and the 21st Panzer Division was assigned to his command in addition to the divisions he already controlled. The British, under General Claude Auchinleck, built up their forces and prepared Operation Battle Axe, an attempt to drive the Axis forces westward. For several months, the line stabilized along a front that stretched from the Mediterranean coast inland through the Gazala line. Tobruk remained garrisoned by Commonwealth forces, a permanent reminder of Rommel's inability to complete his conquest of Cyrenaica. He spent these months reorganizing his command, establishing supply depots, and preparing for offensive operations he hoped would restore his initiative. Yet the supply crisis never truly abated. Every convoy to North Africa ran the gauntlet of British submarines and aircraft. Every month that passed saw German and Italian naval losses accumulate. The Axis was slowly losing the contest for control of the Mediterranean that would ultimately determine the fate of the North African campaign. What Tobruk had taught Rommel, though the lesson would not be fully appreciated by either him or his superiors, was a sobering truth about modern warfare. Tactical genius and aggressive leadership could accomplish remarkable things against unprepared or poorly organized enemies. But against a disciplined, well-supplied opponent, defending prepared positions, these qualities alone were insufficient. The fortress had absorbed his fury and remained standing. It would require fundamentally different approaches that would demand the kind of sustained material superiority that Germany could not provide. Rommel had tasted setback, and while his confidence and offensive spirit would revive with his later triumph at Gazala, part of him understood that he had encountered something more formidable than any tactical obstacle. He had encountered the limits of what a commander, however brilliant, could achieve when divorced from adequate supply, reliable support from superiors, and the material resources necessary to sustain a modern military campaign. Tobruk had not destroyed the Afrika Korps, but it had revealed, to those willing to see it, the fundamental weaknesses that would eventually destroy it. By the spring of 1942, the North African campaign had settled into a kind of savage equilibrium. For months, Rommel had hurled his Afrika Korps against Tobruk's perimeter, and for months, the British had held. The desert around the fortress was scarred with the wreckage of failed assaults, burnt-out tanks, abandoned vehicles, and the bleached remains of positions won and lost in cycles of attack and counterattack. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain. British naval and air forces dominated the sea lanes, strangling Rommel's reinforcements with a relentless grip that no amount of German tactical brilliance could overcome. The situation demanded change, or Rommel would face the slow death of attrition, bleeding away his strength in frontal attacks while his enemies grew stronger. He knew this. His superiors in Berlin knew this. And so, in the darkness of a North African night in late May 1942, Rommel committed himself to the most audacious maneuver of his entire campaign, an operation that would require perfect coordination, audacious timing, and the kind of risk that only a commander convinced of his own genius could contemplate. The British defensive line at Gazala stretched south from the Mediterranean coast, anchored by fortified positions and minefields, defended by infantry divisions and anti-tank guns, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. It was formidable, but it was linear. It was a wall. And Rommel had learned in France and confirmed in Libya that walls could be breached if the attacker possessed the mobility to find the seams and exploit them. But the Gazala line was not merely a collection of trenches. It was a barrier constructed by an enemy now numbering over 100,000 men, supported by aircraft and armor in quantities that approached parity with Rommel's own forces. The British commander, General Claude Auchinleck, had prepared a methodical defense, confident that his superior numbers and the fortified nature of his positions would blunt any assault. He had divided his forces into separate commands, with infantry holding the line and mobile formations held in reserve. This structure would prove fatal, but only if Rommel could execute a maneuver so complex and so dependent on precise timing that a single error would transform it from brilliant strategy into catastrophic disaster. The operation that Rommel conceived was deceptively simple in concept, but ferociously complicated in execution. He would mount a frontal demonstration against the northern sector of the Gazala line, fixing the attention of British command on a relatively narrow frontage. Meanwhile, his main striking force, the bulk of his mobile formations, including the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions and Italian armored corps, would swing far to the south, passing beyond the southern anchor of the British defensive line, and then wheeling north and east to strike the British rear and flank. The maneuver would unfold across the open desert, exposed to observation and counterattack throughout. It required that his subordinates understand his intent precisely, that they maintain formation discipline across difficult terrain, and that they strike at exactly the right moment when the British were still oriented toward the northern threat. For Rommel, sitting in his command vehicle as darkness fell on the 26th of May, this was not a plan. It was an opportunity to prove that German tactical superiority could overcome British numerical advantage, that audacity could defeat caution, and that his vision of mobile warfare was destiny itself. The main striking force moved out into the desert night, a vast column of vehicles and armor stretching across multiple routes to avoid creating a single identifiable target for British reconnaissance. Rommel placed himself forward with the leading elements, as he had done countless times before, observing the terrain, making adjustments, communicating with his subordinates through urgent radio traffic that crackled across the frequencies throughout the night. The assault formations moved through darkness toward their flanking position, while, to the north, other German and Italian units attacked the northern section of the Gazala line, drawing fire and attention. The British noticed the movement. Reconnaissance aircraft reported a dust cloud suggesting significant German vehicle movement, but the sheer scale of the flanking maneuver and the confusion created by the northern attack prevented Auchinleck from immediately grasping Rommel's true intent. By dawn on the 27th of May, Rommel's striking force was positioned south of the Gazala line, and the true nature of the engagement began to reveal itself in a series of violent clashes that would dominate the next several days. What followed was less a single cohesive battle than a series of encounters, clashes, and movements that unfolded across the desert as Rommel's mobile formations wheeled north and east to strike at the British rear. The Gazala Cauldron, as historians would call it, was characterized by rapid movement, confusion, fluid boundaries between attacking and defending formations, and the kind of armored combat that required split-second decisions and willingness to absorb heavy casualties in pursuit of tactical advantage. German columns collided with British anti-tank positions, armored formations, and supply echelons. The British, recovering from their initial surprise, began to concentrate their forces against the German incursion, but their formations were geographically separated and had not been trained to respond quickly to an attack from an unexpected direction. Rommel's assault formations, meanwhile, were operating at the very edge of their logistical sustainability, dependent on captured supplies and running on fuel that would measure their combat time in hours rather than days. The uncertainty that pervaded the battlefield during these encounters was total. British commanders were unsure where the main German thrust was occurring. Rommel's subordinates, isolated in the vastness of the desert, were sometimes uncertain whether they were winning or losing as the tactical situation shifted hour by hour. But Rommel understood the nature of the battle in ways his opponents did not, or at least could not replicate with the same conviction. He had committed himself to a course of action that relied on continuous aggressive pressure, on the assumption that if he maintained momentum and demonstrated absolute confidence in German tactical superiority, the British chain of command would fracture under the strain of uncertainty and disruption. He concentrated his forces to overwhelm isolated British formations, then displaced to strike at fresh positions before the British could establish coordinated defenses. The 15th Panzer Division, under General Walter Neumann-Silkow, crashed into British armored formations. The 21st Panzer Division, commanded by General Georg von Bismarck, struck at anti-tank positions and supply routes. Italian armored formations, operating with greater aggression than was typical for Italian units, pressed northward. Through the chaos, through the dust clouds and the crack of anti-tank fire and the crash of shell impacts, Rommel moved constantly, appearing at critical points, making decisions that cut through the fog of battle with an almost uncanny clarity. By the 29th of May, the situation had shifted fundamentally. The British, despite their numerical superiority, had failed to contain Rommel's maneuver. Their scattered formations had been battered in a series of engagements, and their command structure was in disarray. Auchinleck, unable to impose coherent strategy on the fragmented battle and shocked by the rapidity of German maneuver, began to lose the strategic initiative. The British armored formations, which had begun the battle with more tanks than Rommel possessed, had suffered catastrophic losses in their encounters with German anti-tank guns and panzer formations. More critically, the morale of the British Army, both the officers and the men, had been shaken by the sudden appearance of German forces in their rear and by the evident superiority of German tactical coordination. Rommel had not destroyed the British Army. He had not achieved his original objective of annihilating Auchinleck's forces in a single enveloping maneuver, but he had achieved something more politically and psychologically significant. He had demonstrated once again that tactical brilliance and willingness to accept risk could overcome numerical disadvantage, at least in the short term. As the battle evolved into what would become the 28th of May to the 29th, Rommel's formations began to compress the British forces into an increasingly desperate situation. The British were forced to fight on interior lines, unable to coordinate effectively their dispersed formations. The sand and wind of the desert reduced visibility, turned the landscape into a nightmare of obscured distances and uncertain positions, and provided cover for German movements that should have been detected, but often were not. A pattern established itself. German formations would strike at isolated British positions, overwhelm them through concentration of force, take heavy losses themselves, then move to attack another isolated sector before British reserves could arrive to help. It was a version of tactics that Rommel had perfected in France, adapted to the vastness of the desert. It was, in its way, a masterclass in how to wage war against a numerically superior enemy, through continuous application of pressure, through unwillingness to accept stalemate, through the assumption that aggression itself could compensate for material disadvantage. The breakthrough that Rommel sought came not from a single decisive encounter, but from the cumulative effect of these countless clashes and the steady accumulation of British losses and the erosion of British morale. By early June, the British were beginning to fall back from their Gazala positions. The fortified line that had seemed so impregnable was being abandoned, not because it had been overrun, but because maintaining it had become tactically impossible given the German presence in their rear and the disruption of their supply and command systems. Rommel's audacious maneuver, executed across open desert against an enemy that enjoyed superior numbers and the advantage of prepared defenses, had succeeded in breaking the British will to hold their position. The British began to retreat toward Egypt, and Rommel, having thrown everything he possessed into the engagement, pursued with whatever forces remained mobile. The losses on both sides had been catastrophic. German and Italian formations had suffered heavily in the series of engagements, but British losses had been greater, and more critically, British command had lost its coherence. What happened next was almost an anticlimax to the extraordinary maneuver that had preceded it. With the Gazala line broken and the British in retreat, Rommel pressed his pursuit toward Tobruk. The fortress that had resisted months of siege and assault was suddenly vulnerable, cut off from its supply routes, its garrison weakened by previous fighting and isolated from the main British army. On the 21st of June 1942, German and Italian forces launched an assault on Tobruk's perimeter, and this time, the fortress fell. After months of battering against its walls, after endless assaults that had been repulsed with heavy casualties, Tobruk surrendered. The port facilities, which Rommel had coveted for so long as a means of sustaining his advance deeper into Egypt, fell into German hands relatively intact. For Rommel, the fall of Tobruk was not merely a tactical victory, it was validation. The fortress that had seemed unconquerable had fallen to his continued application of pressure and tactical brilliance. He had broken the British in the desert, and now he possessed the resources to drive them out of North Africa entirely. In Berlin, the news of Gazala and Tobruk's fall was received as a triumph. Rommel's reputation reached its apotheosis. Even Hitler, who was not generous in his praise, acknowledged the achievement. Rommel was promoted to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the Wehrmacht, becoming at 51 years of age one of the youngest men to achieve that distinction. The promotion was a recognition of his tactical genius, his willingness to accept risk, and his apparent invincibility in the desert. German propaganda seized upon the victories, building a mythology around the African commander that would persist long after the actual circumstances of his victories had become irrelevant. For a moment, Rommel seemed positioned to achieve the impossible, to drive through Egypt, seize the Suez Canal, and strike at Britain's position in the Middle East. For a moment, the limitless possibilities of the desert seemed to open before him. But this moment of triumph concealed the truth that was already becoming apparent to anyone who looked beyond the tactical brilliance. Rommel had achieved a victory against an enemy that was rebuilding its strength with American supplies, while his own forces were strangled by supply lines that could not sustain both his ambitions and his army. The Gazala cauldron had been his finest hour as a commander. It would also prove to be the moment when his fortunes began their long, inexorable decline. The victory at Gazala should have been Rommel's moment of absolute triumph. The British Eighth Army lay shattered across the desert, its cohesion fractured, its confidence broken. Thousands of soldiers had been captured or killed. Tobruk, the fortress that had mocked him for months, had finally fallen to his assault. The port's capture delivered fuel, ammunition, and supplies that seemed to answer every logistical prayer the Afrika Korps had whispered into the sand. For the first time since arriving in North Africa, Rommel possessed something more valuable than tactical brilliance. He possessed momentum and the physical means to sustain it. His officers gathered around maps in the sweltering heat, tracing lines of advance that led not back toward Tripoli or Benghazi, but deeper still, eastward into Egypt, toward the Nile, toward Cairo itself. The British Empire's grip on the Middle East appeared within his grasp. Hitler in Berlin saw it too. The Führer sent messages of congratulation and encouragement, granting Rommel authority to pursue the defeated enemy without the usual bureaucratic hesitation. For a commander accustomed to fighting Hitler's indecision as much as he fought the British, this freedom felt almost intoxicating. Yet the mathematics of pursuit are ruthless, and they care nothing for glory or ambition. As Rommel's columns advanced eastward in the weeks following Gazala, the supply lines that had seemed suddenly abundant began to reveal their true fragility. The distances multiplied. From Tobruk to Mersa Matruh was roughly 140 kilometers. From Mersa Matruh to El Alamein was another 250 kilometers. Each kilometer of advance extended the umbilical cord, connecting the Afrika Korps to its ports and bases. Fuel trucks that had seemed plentiful in Libya grew scarcer as they were consumed by the endless desert crossing. Ships carrying supplies from Italy faced growing threat from British and American air power, from submarines lurking in the Mediterranean, from the fundamental reality that shipping capacity was never sufficient for the appetites of a mechanized army. The British had retreated, but they retreated toward their supply bases, not away from them. Every mile backward took them closer to Alexandria, to the Nile Delta, to depots overflowing with ammunition and fuel. Rommel, conversely, advanced away from everything that sustained his army. The paradox was brutal and inescapable. The men of the Afrika Korps felt it first, as soldiers always do. Rations grew smaller. Water, the currency of desert warfare more precious than gold, was rationed more strictly. Mechanics struggled to keep vehicles operational when spare parts arrived sporadically, if at all. The panzer crews, who had become legendary for their aggressive tactics in the Gazala breakthrough, found themselves sitting idle because fuel had to be conserved for future operations that might not occur. Discipline remained rigid, training remained sharp, but morale began its slow erosion. Rommel himself felt the frustration acutely. He was not a man content with consolidation or defensive positions. His genius lay in rapid maneuver, in finding the weak point in an enemy line and exploiting it before the enemy could react. But rapid maneuver required fuel and ammunition in quantities he no longer possessed in abundance. The man who had just defeated one of the empire's finest armies now found himself hobbled by the very success that should have liberated him. He pushed forward nonetheless, because that was his nature and because the opportunity seemed too valuable to squander. The British retreat, however, was not the route that Rommel might have hoped for. General Claude Auchinleck, the British commander, withdrew his forces in orderly fashion, consolidating them at a narrow waste of desert between the Mediterranean coast and the impassable Qattara Depression. This was the line at El Alamein, roughly 66 miles west of Alexandria. The position offered natural strength. The desert south of the main road was intersected by the Qattara Depression, a treacherous area of salt marshes and broken ground that was virtually impassable to armored vehicles. No flank march was possible here. Rommel could not repeat the maneuver that had broken the British at Gazala. He would have to attack frontally against defensive positions, a form of warfare that the Afrika Korps had never needed to wage with competence. The British, despite their recent defeat, had room to maneuver and could choose their ground. They began digging in, establishing defensive lines, preparing anti-tank screens. The momentum that Rommel had seized seemed to slow before it could finish its work. Into this shifting situation arrived a figure who would become Rommel's most formidable opponent. General Bernard Montgomery assumed command of the 8th Army in early August 1942. Montgomery carried with him a reputation for caution, for meticulous preparation, for the systematic destruction of enemy forces rather than the pursuit of dramatic breakthroughs. Where Auchinleck had been subtle and reactive, Montgomery was methodical and assertive. He announced immediately that the 8th Army would not retreat further. The line at El Alamein would hold. He began organizing supplies, bringing order to the chaotic aftermath of Gazala, transforming a defeated and demoralized force into something resembling a coherent military instrument once more. Montgomery was not a cavalry-minded romantic who sought spectacular victories. He was a technician of warfare, a believer in firepower and logistics, in the grinding accumulation of advantage rather than the brilliant maneuver. He and Rommel were in many ways opposite natures, and they would soon collide at a place that seemed to favor neither cavalry nor romance. Rommel, sensing that time was working against him, decided to attack before Montgomery could complete his consolidation. In early July 1942, he launched an offensive against the El Alamein position, probing for the weak point that had served him so well in the past. The British held. Their anti-tank guns, properly positioned and in greater numbers than before, inflicted heavy casualties on attacking panzer formations. The narrow corridor of passable terrain meant that Rommel could not deploy the full width of his forces, could not bring his numerical superiority to bear in the way he had orchestrated at Gazala. After several days of costly attack, he broke off the engagement. The British line had bent but not broken. Rommel withdrew to consolidate his position and prepare for a more carefully planned operation. What emerged from this stalemate was a strange inversion of the previous campaign. Rommel, the master of mobile warfare, found himself preparing for a deliberate attack against a fortified enemy position. His supply situation grew worse as July progressed into August. The demands of the campaign, the losses of men and material, the stretching of lines ever thinner, all conspired against him. Messerschmitt fighter planes, the best close air support the Luftwaffe could provide, were increasingly absent due to the distances involved and the shortage of fuel. British aircraft, operating from bases in Egypt and the Suez Canal zone, grew more numerous and more aggressive. The daylight sky, once contested, increasingly belonged to the Allies. At night, the skies belonged to the desert and to the stars, but even that provided little comfort to Rommel. He could feel the momentum slipping through his fingers like sand itself. The Mediterranean War had become a resource competition, and the Axis was losing decisively. Ships carrying supplies from Italy faced interdiction from British naval forces, from aircraft launched from Malta, from submarines operating in waters that grew more hostile with each passing month. Italian shipping, already suffering from years of attrition, could not compensate for these losses. The Tunisia route, supposedly easier and safer, proved no more reliable. Rommel's estimates of supply arrival bore less and less relationship to reality. Divisions requested ammunition. Ammunition arrived late or not at all. Requests for fuel were met with explanations rather than delivery. The comfortable margins that had existed after Gazala eroded into anxiety, then into crisis management. Hitler, receiving increasingly desperate appeals for resources, responded with grandiose promises and careful explanations of why those promises could not be fulfilled. Shipping capacity was limited. Aircraft production could not match losses. Italy faced its own crisis. Germany faced greater threats in Russia. Each excuse was true. None of them solved Rommel's problem. The human element became more visible as supply crisis deepened. Wounded men who might have been evacuated and treated now had to be left behind or transported in impossible conditions. Officers accustomed to commanding well-supplied units now made decisions about which tasks to abandon because fuel and ammunition for all of them simply did not exist. The pride of the Afrika Korps, its reputation for aggressive action and bold maneuver, collided with the mathematics of attrition. Rommel himself, a man of driving energy and unquenchable ambition, found himself in the unfamiliar position of defending rather than attacking, consolidating rather than advancing, conserving rather than expending. His personal letters from this period reveal growing frustration with Hitler's inability to understand the supply crisis, with the Italian commander's perception of Axis weakness, with the fundamental gap between what he needed to win and what the German state could provide. Yet Rommel did not accept the idea of strategic defeat. In his mind, El Alamein was not the endpoint, but rather a temporary pause, a chance to gather strength before delivering the blow that would carry him to Cairo. He prepared for a new offensive, planned with more care than the previous attempt, coordinated with limited air support and carefully rationed supplies. The offensive would come in late August 1942, a last gamble that everything he had learned about desert warfare, about timing and tactical surprise, could overcome the material disadvantages that were closing around him like a vice. He confided in his officers that this attack would succeed, that the British would break, that the way to the Nile would open before him. Some of his staff shared his optimism, others, particularly those familiar with the supply figures and the widening disparity in available forces, harbored quiet doubts. What neither Rommel nor his staff could fully comprehend was the extent to which the strategic situation had shifted in the weeks since Gazala. The Axis had reached the limits of its African adventure without realizing it had done so. The American entry into the war had changed everything, eventually if not immediately. British industrial capacity, combined with American supplies and eventually American manpower, had begun to tip the balance in North Africa. Aircraft and tank production from American factories would soon swamp the Axis capacity to replace losses. The British, despite their defeat at Gazala, could afford to lose tanks and aircraft and soldiers because the machine that produced replacements operated at scales the Axis could never match. Rommel could not see this yet. He was looking at El Alamein and the Egyptian frontier. He could not see the shipyards of Detroit, or the aviation factories of America, or the vast supplies flowing across the Atlantic to sustain British forces. He saw only the immediate tactical situation, and believed that with proper maneuver and one more bold stroke, he could break through. History, however, had other intentions. As August 1942 turned toward September, Rommel stood at the furthest point of his advance. The desert behind him stretched back more than 2,000 kilometers to Tripoli. The desert ahead of him led to El Alamein, and then to Cairo and the Suez Canal, and the possibility of changing the entire course of the war in the Mediterranean and Middle East. He possessed perhaps his last chance to transform North Africa into permanent German territory, to strike at British power in the region, to shift the entire balance of the Mediterranean war in Germany's favor. He did not possess the supplies, the aircraft, the fresh divisions, or the fuel to accomplish any of this. But he possessed courage and tactical brilliance and a willingness to gamble. In the next weeks, those qualities would be tested against an enemy who had neither his courage nor his tactical genius, but who possessed something far more formidable: material abundance and the patience to use it methodically, remorsefully, and with iron discipline. The summer of 1942 was the last season Erwin Rommel would spend in the ascendant. His supply lines were fractured, stretched across more than 300 kilometers of North African desert, yet his vision remained undimmed. Cairo beckoned. The Nile Delta, with its British bases and fuel depots and the pivot point of imperial power in the eastern Mediterranean, seemed within reach if only he could drive eastward one final time. The maps in his headquarters, the intelligence reports crossing his desk, the whispered conversations among his staff officers, all suggested that one more offensive surge might break the British entirely. What Rommel could not see, because no one could see it from the vantage point of a desert commander in the summer of 1942, was that the window of opportunity was closing. The British were no longer the brittle, improvised force he had outmaneuvered at Gazala. Something had shifted in Cairo and London. A new general was coming. General Bernard Law Montgomery arrived in Egypt in August 1942, and with him came a fundamentally different approach to desert warfare. Where his predecessors had been cautious, calculating risks against the phantom of Rommel's tactical genius, Montgomery brought something simpler and more devastating. He would not fight on Rommel's terms. He would not be outflanked in the open desert. He would not engage in the fluid maneuver that had been Rommel's signature. Instead, Montgomery would choose his ground, mass his forces, and grind. He began immediately to reorganize the Eighth Army, instilling discipline, raising morale, preparing his forces not for the play of maneuver, but for the brutal mathematics of material superiority. The Eighth Army had artillery, tanks and trucks flowing in through supply lines, stretching not across the desert, but across the Mediterranean from Gibraltar, and through the Suez Canal from India and America. Montgomery understood that he possessed something Rommel could never possess in Egypt: the luxury of replacement. When his tanks were destroyed, new ones came. When his soldiers fell, more arrived. Rommel, by contrast, was slowly being strangled by geography and Hitler's inability to understand the logistics of desert warfare. By late September 1942, Rommel had massed his forces for what he intended as a knockout blow against Montgomery's Eighth Army. The position that would determine the battle lay along a line stretching roughly 60 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast south toward the Qattara Depression, a vast natural barrier that made outflanking maneuvers impossible. The small rail station and depot at El Alamein gave the position its name. Here, in this narrow corridor where tactics of mobility meant little and brute force meant everything, Rommel's African dream would be tested and broken. He had faced Montgomery before in the cautious operations of earlier months, but this time something was different. The British commander was not falling back into predictable patterns. His defenses were layered, complex, bristling with anti-tank guns arranged in the kind of dense, coordinated pattern that turned the desert into something resembling the trenches of the Great War. For Rommel, who had spent 3 years proving that the stalemate of trench warfare could be overcome through audacity and mobility, this must have felt like the past reaching up to reclaim him. The First Battle of El Alamein began on the 1st of July, nearly 4 months before Rommel faced Montgomery in the engagement that would bear the name El Alamein. But when historians speak of El Alamein as the turning point, they mean the battles of October and November 1942. By then, Rommel's situation had deteriorated catastrophically. His forward positions had been pushed back by the new British commander. His supply situation, always precarious, had become desperate. Malta, that British-held island fortress sitting astride the supply routes between Italy and North Africa, had been reinforced and now presented a constant threat to German and Italian convoy traffic. Aircraft based there, along with aircraft operating from Egypt, were taking an increasingly terrible toll on transport vessels. Some estimates suggest that more than half of the shipping attempting to resupply the Afrika Korps was being sunk before reaching Libyan ports. Rommel himself was ill during the summer months, suffering from recurring ailments that left him weakened and occasionally absent from his headquarters. When he did leave to return to Germany for medical treatment, he departed with the understanding that Montgomery would likely attack in late September or October. He departed with the grim knowledge that he would be facing an enemy with whom he could not keep pace logistically. Montgomery attacked on the 23rd of October 1942, and the battle that followed was unlike anything Rommel had orchestrated in his 3 years in Africa. The British broke the silence of the desert night with the thunder of nearly 1,000 artillery pieces firing in unison, a barrage designed not to achieve tactical surprise but to achieve psychological dominance and to saturate German defensive positions with fire. The operation was called Lightfoot, and it was predicated on a simple principle: overwhelming force applied methodically against a defender who could not trade space for time because there was no space to trade. The narrowness of the El Alamein position meant that Rommel could not execute the sweeping encirclement that had become his trademark. He could not send armored columns racing around the enemy's flank. He had to meet Montgomery's attack head-on, and when he did so, the mathematics of the confrontation became apparent immediately. The British had more tanks, more guns, more men, more ammunition, and crucially, more replacements for all of these things as they became casualties. Rommel had been forced to return to his headquarters from Germany when it became clear that Montgomery was in fact attacking. He arrived to find a battle already in motion that defied the logic of everything he had learned about warfare in the open desert. The minefields that his own engineers had laid were being penetrated by British sappers working methodically under artillery cover. His anti-tank guns were being overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers. The armored counterattacks he tried to mount against British penetrations were meeting prepared defensive positions that broke the German attacks with coordinated fire. Day after day, the grinding combat continued, with British forces slowly pushing westward through defensive positions that Rommel had hoped would hold for weeks. The casualty figures mounted. The fuel shortage became critical. Hitler, observing from his headquarters in Poland or France, sent orders to hold every position to the last man, with no retreat permitted. For Rommel, caught between the overwhelming materiel advantage of his enemy and the impossible strategic demands of his supreme commander, the situation became untenable. By the 3rd of November 1942, the outcome of the battle was clear, though another week of fighting remained before it was officially concluded. Rommel had no choice but to order a westward withdrawal, beginning the retreat that would consume the remaining 2 years of his military career. The decision to withdraw was not controversial militarily. Any rational assessment of the situation made it obvious that continued attacks would only result in the complete destruction of his forces. But Hitler had forbidden retreat. Rommel, in one of the few acts of insubordination that would characterize his relationship with Hitler, withdrew anyway. He understood that his only hope lay in preserving his remaining forces and attempting to establish a new defensive position further west. The alternative was annihilation, and annihilation would serve no purpose. Yet this withdrawal also marked a psychological turning point for Rommel himself. He had come to North Africa believing that audacious operations, personal leadership, and tactical brilliance could overcome strategic disadvantages. El Alamein proved him wrong. No amount of tactical ingenuity could compensate for the overwhelming material disparity. No amount of personal courage could make up for Hitler's inability to provide adequate supplies and reinforcement. The confidence that had sustained him through 3 years of victories, setbacks, and near-certain operational impossibilities was shaken fundamentally. The retreat that began in November 1942 would continue for more than 800 kilometers across the deserts of Libya and into Tunisia. Rommel executed it with the same tactical skill that had characterized his advance 3 years earlier. He would stand and fight wherever the terrain allowed him to inflict casualties on his pursuers, then slip away before he could be encircled or trapped. But this was now a commander fighting for time, not for victory. The objectives had shifted from the conquest of Egypt and the seizure of the Suez Canal to the more modest goal of preserving what remained of the Afrika Korps as a coherent fighting force. The campaign in North Africa was entering its final phase, and Rommel understood that it was a phase he could not win. He could only hope to delay the inevitable and perhaps to salvage something from the wreckage that German strategy had created. Montgomery pursued carefully, methodically, never allowing Rommel the opportunity to turn on him with sudden tactical brilliance and inflict a catastrophic defeat. The British general had learned the lesson that his predecessors had sometimes forgotten, that Rommel was most dangerous when he felt cornered and could maneuver freely. Montgomery would not give him that freedom. The pursuit would be relentless but deliberate, maintaining sufficient force concentrated to defeat any counterattack while maintaining the pressure that kept Rommel in constant motion. The contrast between the two commanders during this phase of the campaign is instructive. Rommel, the boldest tactician in the North African campaign, was now forced into the role of cautious defender, nursing his diminishing resources and trying to maintain unit cohesion. Montgomery, who would later be criticized for excessive caution, was now the aggressor, the commander pursuing a defeated enemy with calculation and method. The Desert War had reversed its polarity. The First Battle of El Alamein, running from the 23rd of October through the 5th of November 1942, had cost the British roughly 13,500 casualties. German and Italian losses exceeded 13,000 killed and wounded, plus thousands more taken prisoner. But the casualty figures, while significant, tell only part of the story. The real significance of El Alamein lay in what it signified, strategically and psychologically. For the first time since Rommel had arrived in North Africa, a British commander had faced him with both the tactical skill to match his maneuvers and the material advantage to overcome them. Montgomery had not outfought Rommel at El Alamein. Rather, he had refused to fight on Rommel's terms and instead forced a battle on ground and in circumstances where material advantage and coordinated firepower prevailed over tactical ingenuity. In that refusal lay the seeds of Rommel's eventual defeat, not just in North Africa, but in his entire conception of how modern war should be fought. The Second Battle of El Alamein began almost immediately after the first, with British forces attempting to break out of the bridgehead they had established and pursue the retreating German and Italian forces before they could regroup and establish a new defensive line. This second phase of the battle extended from the 6th through the 8th of November, with Rommel attempting rearguard actions to delay the British pursuit while his main forces withdrew westward. The fighting was less intense than the initial assault, but it was no less decisive. By the 8th of November, it had become clear that the battle was lost beyond recovery. The strategic victory had already been secured. What remained was to maintain some semblance of order in the withdrawal and to fight another day from a position further removed from the British supply bases. By the middle of November 1942, Rommel's forces had withdrawn more than 100 kilometers to the west of El Alamein. The grand campaign to seize Egypt and strike at the Suez Canal was finished. The period of rapid advance and tactical brilliance was ended. What lay ahead was 8 more months of grinding retreat, interrupted by occasional counterattacks and rearguard actions, until finally in May 1943, the last German and Italian forces in North Africa would lay down their arms. But the true defeat had come at El Alamein. There, in late October and early November of 1942, Erwin Rommel had encountered an opponent he could not outmaneuver and a situation he could not alter through sheer force of will and tactical genius. The Desert Fox had met his match, and the Fox's greatest strength, mobility, surprise, audacity, had proven insufficient against methodical application of overwhelming force. The lesson was brutal and unambiguous. Rommel would spend the remaining 2 years of his life trying to apply this bitter wisdom in different theaters and different circumstances, but he would never recover the confident belief that tactical brilliance could overcome strategic disadvantage. That confidence had died in the desert at El Alamein. In the autumn of 1942, Erwin Rommel stood at a crossroads. The twin battles of El Alamein had stripped away the aura of invincibility that had followed him since his arrival in North Africa. He commanded an army that was spent, depleted, and increasingly isolated on a continent that had begun to turn against him. Behind him lay nearly 2 years of conquest and audacity. Ahead lay nearly 800 kilometers of abandonment. What followed was not a rout. It was something more complex and perhaps more tragic. It was the slow, methodical unraveling of a military force, caught between the demands of an increasingly detached superior and the pitiless arithmetic of modern industrial warfare. The retreat began in early November 1942, just as the scale of Rommel's defeat at El Alamein became undeniable. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British Eighth Army, possessed numerical superiority so overwhelming that it bordered on cruel. British tanks outnumbered German ones by more than 3-1. Aircraft dominated the sky in ratios that made daylight movement a calculated risk. Supply lines that had always been strained to breaking point now simply broke. From Berlin, Adolf Hitler sent orders that seemed to belong to a different war, fought by an army that still possessed reserves. Rommel received directive after directive demanding that he hold ground, that he fight forward, that under no circumstances should German forces retreat from territory so recently conquered. These orders arrived in radio signals and courier pouches, each one a tether pulling him backward even as reality pulled him forward. The first stage of the retreat took Rommel westward out of Egypt, back through Libya, and deeper into the desert that had served as both refuge and executioner throughout the campaign. His forces fell back deliberately, using anti-tank guns and mobile columns to delay the British advance without becoming decisively engaged. The Afrika Korps, which had once seemed like an instrument of boundless aggression, now became something more subtle, a force executing what military theorists call a fighting withdrawal. Every position was held only long enough to inflict casualties and disorder upon the pursuing enemy before being abandoned. Water supplies proved as critical as ammunition. The desert itself became a weapon that could be turned against an advancing enemy if used skillfully enough. But the British advance came on regardless, sustained by supply lines that stretched eastward toward the Suez Canal and the resources of the entire Mediterranean world. Rommel's relationship with Hitler during these months became increasingly fraught with tension and misunderstanding. The Führer, ensconced in his headquarters in East Prussia, seemed unable to grasp that an army with insufficient supplies and diminishing manpower could not simply refuse to retreat through an act of will. Military problems became political ones in Hitler's view, and political will, he believed, could overcome material reality. Rommel attempted to explain the situation with clarity, born of desperation. The Afrika Korps was not retreating because the soldiers lacked courage. They retreated because they had no fuel for their trucks and tanks beyond what they could capture or produce locally. They retreated because the Luftwaffe could no longer contest the skies with anything resembling equality. They retreated because sustaining even a fraction of the army had become a daily miracle that could not be sustained indefinitely. Hitler listened and then issued orders for counterattacks that could not be executed, and territorial gains that could not be held. As November turned into December, the retreat acquired a rhythm of its own. British forces would develop pressure against a German defensive line. Rommel would evaluate whether the position could be held or whether it must be abandoned. The calculus was always the same: hold long enough to exact a price, then withdraw before being encircled and destroyed. The terrain itself changed character as the Afrika Korps withdrew westward. The relatively open desert gave way to rugged country that favored smaller, more mobile forces. Rommel's command structures adapted to this challenge with the flexibility that had always characterized his leadership. Junior officers were given wide latitude to make tactical decisions. Commanders of company and platoon strength often found themselves making choices about retreat routes and defensive positions without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. This decentralization of command was both a strength and a sign of desperation. It proved that German officers could think for themselves, but it also indicated that higher command structures had largely ceased to function in any cohesive sense. The supply crisis that had plagued Rommel throughout his African tenure now became an existential threat. Ships carrying fuel and ammunition across the Mediterranean fell prey to British aircraft and submarines in increasing numbers. What little arrived at African ports often could not be transported forward to the front lines because the transport fleet itself was being systematically destroyed. German soldiers began rationing at rates that degraded combat effectiveness. Vehicles were cannibalized to keep other vehicles running. Ammunition was parceled out in amounts that forced gunners to make every shot count with the discipline of an army, engaged in siege warfare rather than mobile combat. The German high command seemed unable or unwilling to grapple with this reality. Promises of new supplies and reinforcements arrived regularly, but proved illusory. Rommel, ever the professional, never allowed his desperation to show in his communication with superiors. But his diary entries from this period reveal a man watching his army dissolve into the desert not with the drama of a catastrophic battle, but with the slow suffocation of starvation. By late December 1942, Rommel had withdrawn into western Libya, taking up defensive positions around the town of Agadabiya and the surrounding region. The British advance continued, but had slowed somewhat, partly from the strain of its own supply lines, and partly from Montgomery's characteristic caution. The lull provided a momentary respite for German forces to regroup and reorganize what remained of their combat strength. This period of relative stability proved deceptive. The strategic situation continued to deteriorate, even as tactical operations reached something resembling stalemate. To Rommel's east, the British Eighth Army remained positioned to resume its advance at will. To his rear, and already beyond his ability to influence events, other forces were massing. American and British forces had launched Operation Torch in early November, landing in Morocco and Algeria with the intention of sweeping eastward along the North African coast. This vast encirclement was slowly closing around the German and Italian positions like jaws of a trap. Rommel could see it approaching with perfect clarity, but he lacked the authority to abandon North Africa entirely. He lacked even the authority to begin planning a strategic retreat toward Europe that might preserve some portion of his army for future operations. The year 1943 dawned with Rommel facing a strategic dilemma that no amount of tactical brilliance could resolve. His forces occupied a shrinking portion of Libya, themselves increasingly threatened by the advance of American and British forces from the west, as well as continued pressure from Montgomery's forces to the east. In mid-January, as the Allies drew closer to complete encirclement, Rommel launched a counteroffensive against the American forces that were still consolidating their hold on recently captured territory. This attack, centered around Kasserine Pass in the mountains of Tunisia, achieved initial tactical success. German forces exploited gaps in American defensive lines and inflicted significant casualties on inexperienced American troops. For a brief moment, Rommel demonstrated that his capacity for aggressive maneuver remained intact. American commanders scrambled to reorganize their formations and call down supporting fire. British units were hastily moved to shore up the American position. but the counteroffensive at Kasserine Pass proved to be the final gasp of German aggressive capability in North Africa. Within days, American reinforcements arrived, and American commanders absorbed the tactical lessons of their initial engagement. German forces, unable to sustain the offensive due to lack of fuel and ammunition, began withdrawing back toward more defensible positions. By the end of January 1943, Rommel understood with the clarity of a man watching a mathematical certainty unfold that the Afrika Korps had perhaps 3 months remaining before complete destruction became inevitable. He began planning operations not to win, but to extract maximum damage while conducting an orderly withdrawal. To his increasingly exasperated superiors in Berlin, he continued to request authorization for the kind of strategic pullback that might preserve German forces for other theaters. These requests were consistently denied. Hitler continued to view North Africa as a test of will and refused to acknowledge that will alone could not reverse the material disparity that had become absolute. Through February and into March 1943, Rommel continued his fighting retreat, moving his forces westward and northward in an attempt to consolidate positions in Tunisia, where perhaps some kind of defensive line might be established. He executed these movements with all the skill he had accumulated over 2 years of mobile warfare in the desert. German and Italian forces were compressed into an ever-shrinking territory, their formations thinned and depleted beyond the threshold where replacement was possible. Rommel himself recognized that continuation of the campaign had become futile. He requested relief from command and permission to return to Europe, ostensibly on medical grounds related to ailments he had contracted during his time in Africa. His superiors granted the request with a swiftness that suggested relief rather than reluctance. By mid-March, Rommel had begun the process of handing over command to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. The man who had arrived in Libya with audacious dreams and limited resources now departed from a continent he had dominated for nearly 2 years, leaving behind an army that would be completely destroyed or captured within weeks. The retreat from El Alamein through Libya to Tunisia represented something more than a military defeat. It demonstrated both the apex and the limitation of German military skill. Rommel's forces had executed a fighting withdrawal across 800 kilometers of hostile territory against an enemy with overwhelming superiority in numbers, aircraft, and supplies. The Afrika Korps had inflicted casualties that remained disproportionate to their own losses and had demonstrated that training, cohesion, and boldness could compensate, at least partially and temporarily, for material disadvantage. Yet no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome the fundamental reality of industrial warfare in the 20th century. Germany simply could not produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition at rates necessary to sustain operations across multiple continents against enemies with access to the resources of empires spanning the globe. Rommel understood this. He tried to communicate it to his superiors through professional channels and through carefully worded requests. What he could not do was force Hitler to confront a reality that contradicted the Führer's conception of what was possible through force of will. The legacy of the long retreat was ambiguous and contested, even as events continued to unfold. For the German public and for military audiences throughout Europe, Rommel's withdrawal was presented as evidence of his continued genius for maneuver. The fact that he had conducted an orderly strategic movement in the face of overwhelming odds seemed to confirm his reputation as a commander of extraordinary capability. For British observers, and especially for Montgomery, who had finally achieved clear tactical success against a German commander, the retreat seemed to represent the definitive establishment of British strategic superiority. Yet beneath these narratives lay a more troubling truth. The retreat marked the end of German offensive capability in the Mediterranean and the beginning of a cascade of strategic defeats that would accelerate through 1943 and beyond. Rommel had attempted to manage the impossible, and in that attempt had demonstrated both the heights of tactical achievement and the tragedy of a brilliant commander bound to a regime incapable of understanding when strategic situations had become unmanageable. His retreat from El Alamein was not merely military maneuver, it was the beginning of the end. The year is 1943, and the Afrika Korps finds itself trapped in a closing vice. To the east, General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army advances methodically, grinding forward with overwhelming numerical superiority and supplies that seem limitless by comparison to Rommel's dwindling reserves. To the west, a new threat materializes. American and British forces, having secured a foothold in Morocco and Algeria through Operation Torch, now push eastward into Tunisia with the explicit intention of squeezing the remaining German and Italian forces into oblivion. Between these two advancing armies, Rommel commands roughly 150,000 troops, many of them Italian infantry, whose morale has begun to crack under the relentless pressure. His tanks are worn, his fuel supplies measured in days rather than weeks, and his air support has dwindled to a fraction of what he commanded during the height of his power. The strategic situation is not merely difficult, it is hopeless, though Rommel himself has never fully accepted the word. Rommel's command structure itself has become fractured. He now answers to General Giovanni Messe, the Italian commander of the First Army, yet he also maintains independent authority over the Afrika Korps and answers directly to German headquarters in Europe. This arrangement breeds confusion and conflict precisely when unity of command is most desperately needed. Communications with Berlin remain problematic, delayed by distance and interference, and Hitler's directives often contradict the reality that Rommel confronts daily. The Führer forbids retreat, insisting that every position be held to the last man, yet he cannot provide the reinforcements, fuel, or aircraft needed to make such a stance anything but suicidal. Rommel finds himself in the familiar but increasingly intolerable position of watching his superiors will clash with the laws of physics and logistics. He has learned by now that disagreeing with Hitler brings no reward, only suspicion and removed authority, so he obeys even when he knows obedience leads only to destruction. Yet Rommel has not entirely abandoned hope of turning the tide. In early February, intelligence reports indicate that American forces moving east from Morocco are still relatively inexperienced, and their formations are scattered across a wide front. The Americans, many of them seeing combat for the first time, lack the cohesion and tactical sophistication of veteran British troops. Rommel identifies an opportunity, a weakness, to exploit with precisely the kind of concentrated armored attack that has served him so well in the past. The gateway to this opportunity is a place called Kasserine Pass, a narrow defile in the western Dorsale Mountains of Tunisia, where rough terrain might negate American numerical superiority and force a decisive engagement on terrain that favors mobile tactics. Rommel presents his plan to his superiors. Strike hard at the American center of gravity, shatter their forces in a concentrated blow, and create enough chaos and destruction to buy time for a withdrawal northward toward better defensive positions. The plan carries echoes of his greatest successes: Gazala, the breakthrough at Tobruk, the rapid advances across Libya, but those successes occurred when he possessed far greater resources and faced enemies that had not yet learned to fear the Afrika Korps. The offensive begins on the 19th of February, 1943. German and Italian forces attack from the west, striking the American positions with a fury and precision that the inexperienced American troops are not prepared to withstand. The Americans, surprised by the speed and organization of the German assault, begin to withdraw in confusion. Rommel, present near the front as always, watches his tanks break through the American lines with a grim satisfaction. For a moment, the old magic seems to work. German panzer units penetrate deep into American territory, destroying vehicles, capturing supplies, and spreading panic among rear area units. American commanders struggle to coordinate a response, and several units are surrounded or forced to abandon their positions. The Americans suffer roughly 3,000 casualties and lose enormous quantities of equipment, tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles that will be difficult to replace. The tactical triumph is real and undeniable, and for perhaps the last time in his African career, Rommel experiences the intoxicating sensation of victory. But this victory differs fundamentally from those that came before. In the days following the initial breakthrough, American units begin to reform and consolidate. New supplies arrive from the rear, and commanders who were surprised on the 19th begin to coordinate defensive positions by the 21st. British forces rushing west from the coast begin to arrive in the Kasserine area, lending their experience and firepower to the American effort. Rommel, surveying the changing situation, realizes that the window of opportunity is closing far more rapidly than he anticipated. The concentrated American forces he hoped to destroy are instead concentrating, reinforcing, and being joined by allies who know exactly how to defeat him. He launches renewed attacks on the 22nd and 23rd of February, but each assault encounters stronger resistance than the last. The American soldiers, learning quickly from their initial shock, fight with increasing determination. More importantly, the arrival of British artillery and anti-tank guns creates defensive positions that German tanks cannot simply bulldoze through as they once might have done. By the 24th of February, Rommel makes the decision to withdraw. The tactical victory at Kasserine is real, but it changes nothing fundamental about the strategic situation. The Americans have not been destroyed, merely bloodied. The British continue to advance from the east with methodical inevitability. American reinforcements continue to pour into Tunisia from the west. The resources he expended in the Kasserine offensive, fuel, ammunition, mechanical wear on engines and transmission, cannot be replaced. Rommel withdraws northward into the mountains of Tunisia, establishing defensive positions near the town of Gafsa, then further north toward Mareth. The Americans, having learned their lesson and received reinforcements of their own, do not pursue with recklessness. They advance carefully, methodically, replicating the cautious tactics that British generals have perfected over months of fighting Rommel's forces. The months that follow are dominated by a grim attritional struggle with no hope of German victory. Rommel cycles between various commands and responsibilities, increasingly sidelined as his health deteriorates and as Hitler's confidence in his judgment wavers. The question is no longer how to defeat the Allies, that ceased to be possible months ago, but rather how to salvage as many troops as possible from a campaign that has become a catastrophe. Italian forces disintegrate more rapidly than German units. The Italian soldiers, poorly equipped and poorly motivated, simply cease fighting when the opportunity presents itself. German commanders cannot rely on their allies to hold any position for more than a few days before the Italians either surrender or abandon their posts. By April 1943, German forces number fewer than 80,000 men, spread across a narrowing front that contracts toward the city of Tunis. The beachheads that Rommel once held stretch from Libya across hundreds of kilometers of North African coast, now compressed into a tiny corner of Tunisia. Rommel is recalled to Europe in March, leaving behind a subordinate to command the remaining forces. The official reason given is health concerns. Rommel has in fact suffered from jaundice and exhaustion, but the reality is more complex. Berlin has concluded that the North African campaign is lost, and that Rommel, the general most associated with the Afrika Korps and its operations, must be removed before the catastrophic final collapse. Rommel departs Africa with a mixed legacy. His tactical brilliance in small unit maneuvers and rapid attacks remains unquestioned, and the troops who served under him harbored genuine affection and respect for a commander who shared their dangers. But even Rommel's admirers cannot deny that he has ultimately failed to achieve any of his strategic objectives. Tobruk was never captured. Egypt was never conquered. The Suez Canal remained firmly in British hands. The dreams of striking at the Middle East, of severing the British Empire's vital arteries, all evaporated in the grinding reality of logistics, enemy reinforcement, and the limits of even brilliant tactics when facing overwhelming material disadvantage. The final collapse of German forces in North Africa comes in May 1943, barely 2 months after Rommel has departed for Europe. The remaining German and Italian forces, surrounded and without hope of relief, surrender to the Allies. Roughly 240,000 Axis troops become prisoners, including the final German commanders who remained to oversee the evacuation of what little could be saved. The Afrika Korps, once the instrument of Rommel's greatest triumphs and the terror of British commanders across 3 years of campaigning, ceases to exist. Its tanks are destroyed or captured, its supplies exhausted, its soldiers either dead, wounded, or in captivity. The Axis presence in North Africa, which began with Rommel's arrival in February 1941 with barely more than 10,000 troops, ends in complete military collapse. Yet even in defeat, Rommel's North African campaign retains a peculiar place in the memory of both victors and vanquished. British commanders who fought against him speak with genuine respect for an opponent who never committed the cruelties that marked other theaters of the war. The supply lines were thin and the standards of conduct sometimes questionable, but Rommel's forces did not engage in the systematic massacres and atrocities that characterized the fighting on the Eastern Front. German soldiers who served under him remember a commander who led from the front, who shared their hardships, and who never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. These facts do not erase the fundamental truth that Rommel's campaign in North Africa was ultimately a failure, a brilliant tactical interlude within a strategic collapse. He achieved impressive victories, won deserved respect from his enemies, and demonstrated military skills that would echo through military academies for generations. But he did not achieve the strategic objectives he was sent to North Africa to accomplish, and by early 1943, the question was no longer whether he would win, but only how many of his soldiers he could preserve, as the whole vast structure of the Third Reich began its descent into ruin. In the spring of 1944, Erwin Rommel stood at a crossroads that would define the final chapter of his life. The war in North Africa had long since ended in defeat, and the strategic initiative had passed decisively to the Allies. Germany faced enemies on 2 continents and possessed resources to defend neither adequately. Yet Hitler, driven by a combination of fantasy and wounded pride, demanded that the Atlantic Wall, a chain of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, would hurl back any attempt at invasion. Rommel, recalled from the Mediterranean and appointed commander of Army Group B, found himself tasked with defending the coast of France against an invasion he believed was not merely probable but inevitable. He accepted the assignment with the clarity of a man who has already absorbed too many defeats to harbor illusions, and the determination of a soldier who would do his duty regardless of the odds. The question was no longer whether the Allies would come, but whether anything Germany built could stop them once they did. Rommel's new posting represented both a symbolic elevation and a tacit admission of failure. As commander of Army Group B, operating under the nominal authority of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, he possessed command over German forces in northern France, the very region where he believed the invasion would strike. Von Rundstedt, nearly 70 years old and increasingly marginalized by Hitler's interference, provided titular command while allowing Rommel considerable operational latitude. It was an arrangement that suited Rommel's temperament and capabilities, granting him the independence to act decisively while sparing him the full burden of strategic responsibility for the entire Western Front. Yet independence in 1944 was a hollow gift. Whatever authority Rommel possessed meant nothing without the resources to back it, and resources were precisely what Germany could no longer spare. He inherited a defensive line that existed more in Hitler's rhetoric than in concrete reality, with bunkers that were incomplete, anti-tank obstacles that were insufficient, and troop concentrations that were spread far too thin across a front that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The Atlantic Wall itself was a monument to German ambition outrunning German capability. Hitler had ordered its construction in 1943, envisioning an impregnable barrier that would make any amphibious landing impossible. The concept was sound enough, a series of mutually supporting fortified positions backed by mobile reserves that could counterattack any successful landing. Yet by the time Rommel arrived to oversee its completion, the wall remained largely what it had been from the beginning, more propaganda than protection. Some sections possessed formidable bunkers and obstacles, but many other stretches of coast were defended only by hastily erected stakes and wire, supplemented by troops whose training and morale were increasingly questionable. Rommel understood that he was being asked to perform the impossible, and he set about attempting it anyway. He threw himself into the work with characteristic energy, touring the coast relentlessly, inspecting fortifications, questioning commanders, and demanding improvements to every defensive position. He ordered the installation of additional obstacles in the water, the emplacement of anti-tank guns in mutually supporting positions, and the constant rehearsal of counterattack procedures. What could be done within the constraints of available time and resources, Rommel did, working 18-hour days and compelling his subordinates to match his intensity. Yet from the beginning, Rommel and Hitler held fundamentally incompatible views about how to defend France. Hitler's strategic vision was rooted in a principle he had articulated repeatedly: the invasion must be destroyed on the beaches, during the actual moment of landing. Every available reserve must be positioned close enough to the coast to strike the beachhead immediately, when the Allies would be most vulnerable and before they could establish a foothold. This strategy possessed a certain logical appeal: stop the enemy at the water's edge and avoid having to fight him inland. But Rommel, remembering his experiences in North Africa and mindful of Allied air superiority, recognized that any German reserve moving toward the coast in daylight would be shattered by enemy aircraft before it could reach the beachhead. He proposed instead that mobile reserves should be held deeper inland, positioned to respond after the initial assault, but protected from air attack during the approach march. Hitler rejected this reasoning as defeatist thinking. The reserves, he insisted, would be held close to the coast and would attack immediately. Rommel understood that he was arguing with a man who made decisions based on will rather than analysis, but he continued to argue anyway, knowing that if his views proved correct and Hitler's assumption proved catastrophic, the responsibility would ultimately rest with the Führer and not with him. Yet responsibility mattered less than the survival of whatever forces Rommel could actually defend. The fundamental problem that Rommel confronted cannot be separated from the broader collapse of German power in 1944. The Luftwaffe no longer possessed the strength to contest Allied air superiority, and every German movement by day attracted concentrated attack from above. The German Navy had been reduced to impotence, with every major capital ship either sunk or crippled, and no ability whatsoever to prevent Allied amphibious operations. The German army itself was stretched across three vast fronts: in France, in Italy, and along the entire Eastern Front, and could spare only limited resources for the Western theater. Rommel received reinforcements at a much slower pace than he needed them, and the divisions that did arrive were often understrength, undersupplied, or composed of replacements without adequate training. He was expected to defend nearly 1,000 kilometers of coastline with fewer tanks and fewer troops than the Allies could land in a single amphibious operation. The mathematics of the situation were simply unkind. Rommel knew this with absolute certainty, and he knew that Hitler knew it as well, yet both men continued the preparations as though they believed victory was possible. Rommel's analysis of where the invasion would strike proved accurate. He correctly identified Normandy as the most probable landing site, based on logical assessment of distance, beach suitability, and proximity to German-held ports. Yet Hitler had convinced himself that the Allies would strike at Pas-de-Calais, further north and closer to Germany itself. This belief was reinforced by an elaborate deception campaign conducted by Allied intelligence, which fed Hitler's preconceptions through various deceptive means. As a result, German reserves were held too far north, positioned to defend against an invasion that would never come. Rommel's protests went unheeded, and his recommendations to shift forces southward were rejected or only partially implemented. It was a final, bitter illustration of the fundamental problem that had plagued the German war effort. Hitler's strategic judgments, even when they proved catastrophically wrong, could not be overruled by any subordinate, no matter how prescient or experienced that subordinate might be. The measures Rommel did implement showed his characteristic ingenuity and determination. He ordered the flooding of low-lying areas behind potential landing zones to prevent airborne forces from gathering. He insisted on the emplacement of mines, hundreds of thousands of them, to deny the beaches to landing craft, and to channel any amphibious assault into killing zones where defending forces could concentrate their fire. He had obstacles erected in the water at varying depths to rip the bottoms from landing craft before troops could even disembark. He demanded that every position be carefully reconnoitered and that firing lanes be cut in the vegetation to provide clear fields of fire. He ensured that supply caches were distributed throughout the defensive line so that units could sustain themselves even if communication with higher headquarters was severed by air attack. It was comprehensive, methodical defensive work, executed by a man who understood that when the test came, there would be no second chances. Yet Rommel was also a realist. He knew that regardless of how well the beaches were fortified, if the Allies achieved a successful landing, the defensive battle would quickly become a question of reserves and logistics, and in both areas, Germany was hopelessly outmatched. As 1944 progressed through the spring and toward summer, the evidence that invasion was approaching became unmistakable. Allied aircraft multiplied over France, and the bombing campaign against German infrastructure intensified. German intelligence intercepted indications of Allied preparations, and Rommel's own scouts reported increased reconnaissance activity and naval maneuvers. Yet Hitler remained strangely hesitant about reinforcing the Western Front adequately, refusing to accept that the Soviet Union posed less immediate threat than the approaching invasion from the West. Every division that Rommel received was followed by a demand that it be released to other theaters. Every tank that arrived had to be rationed carefully across the entire front. Every piece of artillery had to be used to defend multiple sections of coast. Rommel found himself repeatedly begging for resources and receiving only a fraction of what he requested. He became increasingly frustrated with Hitler's refusal to acknowledge the strategic reality that Germany could not simultaneously defend Russia, Italy, and France with the forces available. Yet he channeled this frustration into the work itself, driving himself and his subordinates ever harder, never allowing the limitations of available resources to become an excuse for inadequate preparation. The divergence between Rommel and Hitler over strategy extended beyond merely tactical questions. Rommel had come to believe, gradually and reluctantly, that the war could not be won militarily. He saw the vast productive capacity of America, the growing strength of the Soviet Union, and the consolidation of British-American alliance, and he understood, with the clarity that comes from honest appraisal, that Germany simply lacked the resources to defeat all three powers simultaneously. This realization did not make him disloyal, but it did make him more willing to question Hitler's decisions and to advocate for courses of action that might preserve German strength, even if they could not achieve victory. He began to suggest that once an invasion was repulsed, if an invasion could be repulsed, Germany should seek a negotiated peace. These suggestions were carefully phrased and delivered through appropriate channels, but they represented a fundamental shift in Rommel's position. A man who had built his reputation on unwavering obedience was now tentatively suggesting that obedience must be limited by the demands of reason and military necessity. By early 1944, Rommel had also become increasingly aware of the growing conspiracy against Hitler within German military and political circles. Officers and civilians alike had come to see the continuation of the war as self-destructive and Hitler's leadership as catastrophic. Conversations that Rommel heard and visits that he received informed him of the existence of plots to remove Hitler from power. He did not seek involvement in these conspiracies, and he maintained his position as a line officer rather than a politician. Yet he began to tacitly acknowledge that some form of political change might become necessary, and he allowed himself to be associated, at least peripherally, with officers and officials who believed that Germany's only hope lay in ending the war through negotiation rather than continuing to prosecute a conflict that could only end in total defeat. This position was extraordinarily dangerous. Rommel knew that merely expressing skepticism about Hitler's judgment could be interpreted as disloyalty and could result in his removal or worse. Yet he could not in good conscience prepare defensive measures that he believed were futile, nor could he refrain from pointing out to his superiors that the strategic assumptions upon which German planning rested had become disconnected from military reality. The spring of 1944 was thus a season of contradiction for Rommel. He worked with tremendous intensity to strengthen the Atlantic Wall, pouring all his tactical knowledge and personal determination into preparations that he believed were ultimately insufficient. He demanded that his subordinates execute his instructions perfectly, yet he knew that perfect execution of imperfect plans would not save Germany. He maintained his position as a loyal soldier of the Wehrmacht, yet he had begun to question whether loyalty to Hitler and loyalty to Germany had become incompatible. He prepared France for invasion with the technical skill of a man who understood defensive warfare, yet he understood also that Germany had lost the initiative and that all the fortifications in the world would not restore it. The waiting for invasion became a kind of torture, not physical torture, but the psychological strain of a man who sees catastrophe approaching and is powerless to prevent it. Rommel toured the beaches repeatedly, checking on fortifications, speaking with commanders, and attempting to will Germany's defenses into invulnerability through sheer force of personality and dedication. But he knew, even as he worked, that the test would come in June, and that it would reveal all the inadequacies that had been apparent to him from the moment he arrived. By late May 1944, Rommel's preparation was as complete as it could be, given the constraints he faced. The beaches were mined and wired, the bunkers were manned and supplied, and the mobile reserves were positioned as well as Hitler's strategy permitted. The men under his command were ready as men facing overwhelming odds can be. In the final days before the invasion, Rommel visited his troops, speaking to them about the importance of the coming battle and the necessity of absolute commitment to stopping the enemy on the beaches. He carried himself with the confidence of a soldier about to face a test, but those close to him could see the strain in his face and hear the edge in his voice. He knew what was coming, and he knew what it would require to stop it. As June arrived and the weather patterns that had delayed the invasion began to shift, Rommel waited, knowing that the moment of truth was approaching. The Atlantic Wall was ready. Germany was not. And Rommel, the architect of Germany's coastal defense, was about to discover whether human will and tactical brilliance could overcome the vast material and strategic disadvantages that now confronted the Third Reich. In the spring of 1944, Erwin Rommel stood at the edge of catastrophe. The maps on his desk in France showed what every German commander understood but dared not speak aloud. The Reich was surrounded. Soviet forces pressed from the east. American and British strength grew daily in the west. The Atlantic Wall, that vaunted line of fortifications stretching from the Spanish border to Denmark, existed largely on paper and in propaganda broadcasts. Rommel had been sent to make it real. He toured the Normandy coast obsessively, inspecting bunkers, demanding improvements, pushing engineers and soldiers to exhaustion. He understood that this line of sand and concrete would be tested soon, and that failure here meant the beginning of the end. His letters home grew darker. He no longer wrote of victories, he wrote of duty, of doing one's best in the face of impossible odds. He was 52 years old and had spent his entire adult life in service to a military tradition he loved. But now that tradition served a man and a system he had come to regard with something approaching contempt. The invasion, when it came, arrived on the 6th of June. Rommel was not at his headquarters when the news reached him. He had driven to Germany on the 4th, partly to attend a conference, partly because he believed the landings would not occur for several days yet. The weather had been foul. Meteorologists on both sides believed the rough seas would prevent an assault. When Rommel heard the reports, thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, landing across a front more than 50 kilometers wide, he felt something close to despair. He had been right about the invasion. He had been wrong about the timing. Within hours, he was racing back to France in his Horch staff car, knowing already that the war's outcome was sealed. The generals around Hitler would deny this truth for months. Rommel could not afford such denial. He had spent 3 years in North Africa watching supply lines fail, watching numerical superiority prove decisive, watching tactical brilliance meet the immovable object of industrial capacity. It was happening again, but this time on his own continent, in the heart of German territory. The first hours of the Normandy invasion revealed the fundamental flaw in German defensive planning. Rommel had advocated for a strategy of massive counterattack, concentrating panzer reserves close to the beaches, throwing everything at the invaders while they were vulnerable in the shallow water and struggling to establish beachheads. This strategy made military sense, but it required Hitler to delegate authority, to allow commanders on the spot to commit reserves without waiting for orders from his headquarters at Rostenburg. Hitler was incapable of such delegation. The most powerful panzer divisions in France remained tied up, immobilized by Hitler's insistence that he personally authorize any major movement. Precious hours were lost. By the time some reserves were released, the Allies had secured their perimeter. The window of opportunity, never large, had closed. Rommel understood this within hours of the landings. He sent urgent messages requesting immediate counterattack. The replies came back slowly, hedged with conditions, qualified by Hitler's strategic vision of a grand counterstroke that would drive the invaders back into the sea. That counterstroke never materialized. Instead, what emerged was a grinding, attritional nightmare. The fighting in Normandy became something Rommel had not experienced since the trenches of the First World War. Static warfare, positional combat, measured in meters gained and lost over days of fighting. The bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, negated much of the advantage that armored mobility might have provided. British forces, landing on the eastern beaches, faced the more heavily fortified German positions. The American forces, landing to the west, encountered determined but initially disorganized resistance. The Germans had expected the invasion to come elsewhere. Many of Rommel's best divisions were deployed far from the actual landing sites. Moving them forward took days. By then, the Allies had established themselves firmly ashore. The British Eighth Army under Bernard Montgomery, Rommel's old adversary from North Africa, displayed a methodical approach to breaking the German defenses. Montgomery was patient. He built up supplies, concentrated his forces, and attacked deliberately, rather than rushing into the kind of rapid envelopment that Rommel might have attempted. For a commander accustomed to operating at speed, to exploiting gaps in enemy lines with savage mobility, Montgomery's deliberate approach must have seemed almost insulting. But it worked. Each day, more Allied supplies landed on the beaches. Each day, more men, more vehicles, more artillery pieces were unloaded and pushed inland. The Allies had air superiority so complete that German daylight movement became nearly impossible. Every convoy risked destruction from fighter bombers. Every concentration of vehicles drew air attacks. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, was virtually absent. German commanders had to move at night, attack at night, shift reserves under cover of darkness. The advantage of speed and maneuver that had characterized Rommel's earlier campaigns evaporated in daylight hours. Losses mounted. German companies that should have numbered 150 men were down to 60 or 80. Battalions became companies. The replacements that arrived came undertrained and desperate. The German military machine in France was burning through men at a rate its industry could no longer replace. Rommel, watching the mathematics of attrition, understood that time was entirely on the Allied side. Every day of the campaign favored them. Every day cost the Germans resources they could never recover. The British effort to capture Caen, a city only a few kilometers inland from the beaches, became emblematic of the larger struggle. Montgomery had expected to take Caen in the first days. The Germans, using the city's rubble and surrounding terrain, held on. Street by street, building by building, the fighting continued. British forces battered the city for weeks. The Canadians, attacking to the northwest, were sucked into grinding combat. The Americans, pushing inland from the west, encountered fanatical German resistance. Each German position was held until it became untenable, then the line fell back to the next prepared position. It was fighting without drama, without the spectacular breakthroughs and sweeping maneuvers that had characterized earlier campaigns. It was work, bloody, exhausting work. Rommel threw himself into this combat with the same intensity he had shown in North Africa, but he was fighting a battle he could not win, against an enemy with inexhaustible supplies, against orders from above that frequently made no sense. By late June, Rommel's relationship with Hitler had become strained to the breaking point. He began sending reports that grew increasingly critical of the Führer's strategy. He requested meetings at headquarters to argue for more realistic assessments of the situation. Hitler refused some requests and allowed others, summoning Rommel to Germany to hear the inevitable denunciations that followed any suggestion of retreat or defensive consolidation. Rommel sat through these sessions, listening to Hitler's tirades about wonder weapons, about dramatic counteroffensives that existed only in the Führer's imagination. He would return to France, chastened, but unchanged in his assessment. The war was lost. Germany could not defeat an alliance of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The only rational course was to negotiate an end to the fighting. This conviction became the foundation for everything that followed. Rommel began to separate himself from the regime he served. He began to listen to men who spoke of removing Hitler from power. He had not sought conspiracy. Conspiracy found him, because all rational men in Germany could see the abyss toward which they were hurtling. Through July, the pattern of combat continued its relentless rhythm. The Americans broke out to the west and south, fighting through the bocage with increasing skill and ruthlessness. The American forces finally broke through the German lines in late July, after weeks of grinding combat. The Germans executed a counterattack against the Americans near Mortain, a final attempt to punch through and isolate the invading forces. Rommel had objected to this operation, believing it hopeless, but Hitler had ordered it executed. The attack achieved surprise initially, but could not be sustained. The Allies contained it within days. As the German counterattack collapsed, the Allies began to encircle the German forces that had been fighting in Normandy for 6 weeks. To the north, Canadian and Polish forces pushed south. To the east, the Americans wheeled northward. Between them, tens of thousands of German soldiers suddenly faced the prospect of being trapped. The escape route narrowed. The Falaise Pocket, as it came to be known, became a nightmare of desperate retreat and overwhelming firepower. Rommel was not present for the final catastrophe in Normandy. On the 17th of July, he was wounded by Allied aircraft while driving near Livarot. His staff car was attacked and crashed. He was thrown from the vehicle, suffering serious head injuries and fractures. The injury removed him from active command at the moment when his situation was becoming dire. He was evacuated to Germany, where he spent weeks recovering. The Normandy campaign continued without him, and without his presence, German command became even more fragmented and chaotic. The divisions trapped in the Falaise Pocket were destroyed or scattered. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured. Hundreds of thousands more poured eastward in retreat. By the end of August 1944, the campaign in Normandy was over. The Germans had lost. The invasion had succeeded. The road to France's liberation lay open. The aftermath of Normandy transformed Rommel in ways that the battles of North Africa had not. In North Africa, he had been defeated, but he could tell himself that the campaign had demonstrated the weakness of his enemies, the supply system that failed him, the distance across which he was operating. Normandy had no such comfortable explanations. The invasion had succeeded because the Allies had trained their forces well, because they had coordinated their attacks effectively, and because they possessed overwhelming superiority in men, materiel, and air power. The outcome had been foreordained, visible to anyone willing to see it clearly. Rommel was willing to see it. The conversation with Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commander of the Western Theater, became famous in German military circles. When Rundstedt was asked by Hitler what he recommended, Rundstedt allegedly replied, "Make peace, you fool." Whether or not the words were exactly these, the sentiment represented what many senior commanders understood. Rommel was among them. The war was lost. Germany could not win. The only questions now were how many more men would die before the fighting stopped, and whether Germany could salvage anything from the ruins of defeat. The months between his wounding in July and the event